Habitat. Chapter 1. Nolan Beckett jolted awake, his lungs screaming for air. He felt the frigid water, the salty sting, but the scariest part was the lack of oxygen. Submerged in darkness, Nolan struggled beneath the suffocating grasp of icy water. Gritty sand scraped against his face, adding to his disorientation. With the realization he was underwater, he fought to raise his head above the waves, each breath a desperate gasp against the relentless sea. As he broke the surface, the waves transformed from a muffled roar to an overwhelming din. Panic and adrenaline surged, driving him to expel the salt water choking his lungs. The sea's force, constant and unyielding, threatened to submerge him again. Around him, indistinct shadows hinted that he was on a beach's edge, while confusion clouded his mind. His limbs, weak and numb, barely responded, trembling under the strain. Waves battered him, each one a challenge to his resolve. With sheer determination, Nolan attempted to rise, his muscles unsteady. Coughing violently, he spewed water in painful bursts, each one a harsh reminder of his near-death experience. Inching forward, Nolan clawed at the wet sand, every movement a battle for survival. As he dragged himself onto drier ground, the water's menacing hold lessened. Exhausted but resolute, he savored each painful, sweet breath, his body a mix of relief, pain, and overwhelming fatigue. He collapsed onto his back, content to let unconsciousness reclaim him. He lay there, gazing up into the darkness, feeling puzzled. Where he expected to see the sky, there was none. No stars, no moon. It was strange. Despite looking upwards, he felt an odd sensation of viewing the world from a great height. But then, cutting through the monotony of the crashing waves, he heard something else. A sound that didn't belong. A gurgling noise. The frantic splashing of someone struggling against the same merciless sea that had nearly claimed him. A scream was cut short, its echo lingering in the air like a ghost. Nolan forced himself into a sitting position, and the world spun. A wave of intense vertigo washed over him, making the darkness seem to sway and churn like the sea itself. His breaths came in ragged gasps, each one a struggle. Lightheadedness gripped him, a fog clouding his thoughts, yet he fought through, determined to grasp his bearings. He took in his surroundings with a sense of surreal detachment. The night was oppressive and dark, the world above absent of stars. Something about the beach felt off. Before he could identify what felt different, he saw the rest of the scene. Scattered around him, half submerged in the shallow waters, were jagged scraps of metal. Like eerie monuments of a disaster, they jutted from the sand and waves. Beyond the breakers, the wreckage was even more pronounced. The charred remnants of a spacecraft, unrecognizable and ablaze, sent flames into the night sky. The water churned around the debris, massive air bubbles gurgling out of the sinking wreckage. Memories flooded back to him. The NASA mission, the Bentham anomaly, the catastrophic crash of Ranger 4. It was all real. Amidst the chaos of his recollections, another desperate cry pierced the night again. Help! Panic and despair filled the person's voice. Nolan's head still swam, but survival instincts kicked in. He got to his feet, scanning the wreckage. Towards the front of what used to be the Ranger 4 spacecraft, a figure struggled against the merciless pull of the sea. They flailed to keep their head above the water, their silhouette barely discernible in the dim light. Nolan's gaze swept across the rest of the beach, revealing a grim tableau of survival. A couple 100 feet away, Anika Patel, their communications officer, also lay in a vulnerable state. The relentless tide submerged half of Anika's body, trapping her under a massive chunk of the spacecraft. The sea, indifferent to her condition, lapped at her unconscious figure, concealing her beneath both water and metal. Nearby, an ejection seat entangled Richard Doyle, the crew's life support specialist. He battled against both the chair and the sea's unforgiving waves. His efforts were frantic, yet fruitless, as each wave thwarted his attempts to get free. Above the chaos, at the edge of the dense foliage, another surreal scene unfolded. An ejection seat dangled precariously from a tree, swaying in the ocean breeze. Ava Martinez, their medical officer, was suspended in it, 30 feet in the air. Her silhouette hung limp against the backdrop of leaves. The parachute that saved her from the crash now held her captive in a perilous state. From the dunes, Doyle's voice cut through the air, desperate and strained. "Come back here, Marcus. Help me get out of this cursed thing." But Marcus, their propulsions engineer, wasn't listening, focused intently on something unseen. Nolan's gaze followed Marcus, standing at the edge of the dunes, unharmed yet transfixed by something in the foliage. He could just make out a shadow, a shifting form, mysterious and foreboding, just within the edge of the jungle. Marcus followed it, as if drawn by an unseen force, disappearing into the shadows. Nolan reeled with questions, but the moment's urgency left no room for speculation. He had to act. The voice beyond the waves called out again, tinged with terror, snapping his attention back to the emergencies at hand. "Please." The plea was heart-wrenching. "Please, help me." The waves, unyielding, crashed over the person in distress. As the wreckage of the Ranger continued its descent into the abyss, their head dipped below the water and didn't resurface. Nolan's heart pounded in his chest. He knew he had to act. With a deep breath that did little to steady his racing heart, Nolan steeled himself. He pushed aside the pain, the dizziness, and the overwhelming sense of despair. He had survived the crash, but survival was no longer enough. Chapter 2. In the moment's chaos, Nolan's instincts took over. He dashed across the beach towards Anika, trapped and unmoving beneath a colossal shard of the Ranger's hull. The relentless sea lapped at her, threatening to engulf her. Approaching Anika, Nolan's eyes flicked to Richard Doyle, ensnared in a struggle of his own. Doyle's ejection seat, a tangle of metal and fabric, had ensnared him in its grip amidst waist-high waves. His movements were frantic, hindered by the parachute cords wrapped around him as he fought to escape the relentless pull of the water. Doyle wore a look of panic, yet his predicament paled compared to Anika's perilous situation, or the desperate cries echoing from the wreckage nearby. Nolan turned his attention back to Anika and hoped to himself that she was still alive. The weight of the Ranger's hull fragment pinned Anika down, submerged beneath the inky depths. Her head bobbed above the water, a small mercy in the midst of their nightmare. As Nolan reached her, Anika's eyelids fluttered, a faint groan escaping her lips. She was breathing, yet unconscious and incoherent. Urgency coursed through Nolan's veins as he approached the wreckage. The jagged metal of the hull fragment glared under the dim light. He seized the sharp edges, his hands protesting against the unforgiving steel. He pushed with a grunt, veins standing out on his forehead. The fragment remained in place. He shifted, trying a different angle, pulling with a desperate strength. Yet, it didn't budge. His gaze flicked to Doyle, still ensnared in his parachute. Time was slipping away. Nolan waded through the water towards him, pushing against the force of the tides. "Doyle!" he shouted over the roar of the waves. "I need your help! I can't get her free by myself!" Doyle, entangled and frustrated, looked up. "Sure," he said, his voice laced with exasperation. "I'd be happy to help, except I'm a bit tied up here." Nolan didn't miss a beat. He began untangling the parachute cords. Finding a sharp edge on the metal of the ejection seat, he sawed at a cord. The material, tough yet yielding, gave way. With one strand free, the others followed. "There," Nolan said. "Hurry up. Let's get her." Together they approached the debris. They lifted, the hull fragment giving way. They heaved again, and it toppled over, freeing Anika. Crimson rivulets bled through the water. Both of Anika's legs were mangled, and Nolan could see what looked like a wicked piece of shrapnel protruding from her side. He looked away, queasy. "Pull her up to shore," Nolan said, already moving back towards the sea. "Someone else is out there." Doyle nodded in understanding, and Nolan plunged into the waves. Chapter 3. Nolan dove into the chest-deep water, swimming beneath the turbulent breakers where the current was less resistant. The pitch-black depths enveloped him. He pushed ahead, driven by a singular focus to reach the main wreckage of the Ranger. As Nolan neared the site, the chaos of water and sputtering air around him intensified. It was a whirlpool of destruction, the Ranger's final throes in this strange sea. He moved with purpose, every stroke a battle, every second a race against time. In the murky depths, Nolan's senses were heightened. He felt the proximity of the wreckage more than he saw it, the frenzied movement signaling he was close. Nolan swam with a sense of urgency, the shapes of debris creating ominous shadows in the surrounding water. Nolan surfaced just long enough to inhale a deep breath, and then plunged into the depths, the weight of urgency propelling him towards the dimly lit, sinking remnants. He felt large bubbles from the sinking wreckage graze his skin as he dove deeper. Under the waves, sound became a distant concept, replaced by a muffled silence that felt both oppressive and isolating. Dim light filtered through the water, revealing the dark, looming forms of the wreckage, still emitting faint glows from within. He spotted the person below, struggling in vain to get away from the Ranger's hull. It was Lieutenant Grace Harper, the Ranger's primary pilot, caught in the throes of panic. Her eyes, wide with terror, locked onto Nolan, flickering with a hint of hope. She gestured towards her leg, trapped in the twisted metal and wires of the wreckage. Nolan dove towards her, noticing how her dark hair swirled in the water's current, the chaos of the scene marked by a trail of frantic bubbles. As he got closer, her crisis became clear. A hazardous tangle of metal, glass, and wires ensnared her. The wreckage descended into the depths, pulling her down with it. As the debris sank closer to the sea floor, the once clear waters turned into a cloudy maelstrom. Billows of silt, disturbed by the colossal impact, rose like phantoms, blanketing the underwater world in a murky shroud. Visibility dwindled, making the task of freeing Grace increasingly challenging. Then, without warning, something sinuous brushed against his leg. Startled, he kicked instinctively, his heart pounding in his chest. What the heck was that? His thoughts raced, conjuring images of unseen creatures lurking in the abyss. The touch had been fleeting, but unmistakable. Something alive, something other than the cold metal and debris. With a surge of adrenaline, Nolan propelled himself forward, his movements now tinged with a sense of urgency and fear. He felt another brush of movement, sending shivers up his spine. His hand searched in the cloudy water, groping for Grace. His fingers grazed over twisted metal and broken components, the remnants of Ranger, now just fragments in the deep. All the while, he was aware of the surrounding presence in the shadows. Nolan found Grace in the murk, grabbing the sturdy fabric of her pant leg, trying to pull her free. But it was futile. The debris held fast, unyielding. Nolan felt a wave of anxiety threaten to overwhelm him as his lungs screamed for air. In his rising panic, Nolan forced himself to close his eyes for a moment, seeking a brief respite in the water's calmness. Despite the chaos and the frantic energy of the sinking wreckage, he sought a moment of serenity to clear his mind. And in that momentary pause, an idea sparked, and he knew what to do. When Nolan reopened his eyes, the sight that greeted him was like a scene plucked from the deepest recesses of a nightmare. An eel, monstrous and grotesque in its strange form, slinked past him with an unsettling fluidity. Its skin was a glossy, iridescent black, shimmering in the dim light filtering down from above. Its eyes were pale orbs, adding to its nightmarish visage. It moved with a predatory grace, undulating through the water with an ease that belied its monstrous nature. Nolan's heart pounded against his ribcage, a drumbeat of primal fear. He tried to focus, to push away the terror that clawed at his mind. Another elongated shape emerged from the murky depths, confirming his worst fears. There wasn't just one. There were many. The surrounding ocean teemed with these serpentine creatures, each one a silent threat in the underwater gloom. He forced himself to focus, to concentrate on the task at hand. Fear had to wait. Survival could not. Nolan repositioned himself against the twisted labyrinth of metal and wires that made up the wreckage. He braced his back against a relatively solid piece of the debris, his feet finding precarious purchase on another. The position afforded him some leverage, a chance to exert more force in his attempt to free Grace. Nolan refocused on his idea to free her. Instead of pulling Grace out of the entrapment, he pushed her further in, deepening her into the window she'd tried to escape through. The change in tension worked. The debris loosened. It had been a jumbled knot, but now it shifted positions, resettling all around him. He signaled to Grace, urging her to stay calm as he worked to untangle her. His lungs burned with the need for oxygen, but he focused on freeing her. As the debris gave way, Grace propelled herself upwards, a flurry of bubbles marking her rapid ascent. Nolan positioned his feet against the battered hull of the Ranger 4, muscles tensed. With a forceful push, he propelled himself upwards, aiming for the distant glimmer of the surface. But his ascent abruptly halted. A sharp tug at his leg revealed that the same twisted debris that had trapped Grace now ensnared him. Panic clawed at Nolan's throat as he tried to signal Grace, but she was already fading from sight, too far to notice his plight. Alone, his lungs screamed, the burning sensation intensifying with each passing second. It was a raw, desperate feeling, like fiery claws scraping inside his chest, each breath a battle he was losing. Around him, the sinuous eel-like creatures emerged from the silty shadows, darting past with increasing boldness. Their sleek bodies slithered through the water. Nolan bent over, his fingers fumbling at the wire wrapped around his leg. It was biting into his skin like a multitude of tiny razors. One of the creatures, bolder than the rest, surged towards him, halting mere inches from his face. Nolan's fist swung through the water in a sluggish, hampered arc, the eel evading with a fluid swerve. Each time Nolan shifted his focus to the wire, another eel emerged, its sinister form slithering into his peripheral vision. Desperation lending him strength, he wrenched a jagged piece of the hull free, gripping it like a makeshift weapon. His lungs were on fire, the need for air an all-consuming agony. He felt he could hold his breath no longer, when an eel, with terrifying speed, lunged from the gloom. Nolan thrust the jagged metal forward, gashing the creature's side. The water clouded with blood, sending the other eels into a frenzy. Suddenly, Grace appeared from above, her face etched with horror at the sight of the nightmarish swarm of eels. Nolan swung the metal shard, driving the eels back just enough to keep them at bay. Grace, with frantic urgency, set to work on the wire entangling his leg. Nolan jabbed at the eels, warding off their incessant attacks. Seconds stretched into eternity before the wire around his ankle slackened. Relief flooded through him as Grace severed the last of the entanglement. He pushed off the hull once more, surging upwards beside Grace, every fiber of his being yearning for the air above. But their escape was not unchallenged. An eel, undeterred, darted out of the shadows, its jaws gaping wide in a silent scream. Nolan swung the metal, but he was too slow. The creature's jaws clamped around Grace's calf, her body writhing in pain and shock. With a desperate thrust, Nolan drove the shard into the eel's side. It released Grace, recoiling back into the abyss below. They were free, but not safe. After what felt like an eternity, they broke into the night above, their chests heaving as they gasped for the cool night air. The relief was overwhelming, but there was no time to rest. They were close enough to shore that they could stand, the sea's depths giving way to shallower waters. The beach, now bathed in the soft light of an artificial dawn, revealed to Nolan a world that defied all his expectations. He stood there, mouth agape, as the first rays of light illuminated the surrounding habitat. The land before him curved upwards in a mesmerizing arc, reaching into where the sky should have been and continuing in a grand loop all the way around. It was as if he was standing inside an immense tube, its interior covered in lush landscapes. Beyond the sandy beach, a dense jungle sprawled out like a living emerald carpet. The trees, towering and ancient, seemed to defy gravity as they extended upwards and then curved over him, part of a ring of luxuriant life that encircled the entire space. And the sea, a body of water that should have laid flat, instead bent upwards, its surface curving until it merged with the horizon, in a perplexing defiance of Nolan's understanding of physics. Looking upwards, Nolan's eyes followed the terrain wrapping above him, miles away on the other side of the tube. The land there mirrored his own position, an inverted world teeming with its own vibrant life. In the distance, the landscape unfolded into various natural wonders. Rolling hills gave way to majestic waterfalls that cascaded down invisible cliffs, their mist catching the light and creating ephemeral rainbows. Birds, or creatures much like them, soared across this enclosed universe, their silhouettes etched against the backdrop of sparse, fluffy clouds. Serpentine rivers snaked through the terrain, their waters a shimmering ribbon of life amidst the lushness. And everywhere, the vibrant hues of exotic flowers punctuated the greenery, adding splashes of color to the verdant tapestry. Yet, amidst this vivid display of natural splendor, a stark contrast loomed in the far distance. Nolan studied the crumbling remains of what appeared to be an ancient metropolitan city. The landscape, once dominated by towering skyscrapers, now lay in ruin. These colossal structures, symbols of a forgotten civilization, had toppled, their skeletal frames being taken over by the relentless embrace of nature. Even from miles away, Nolan could discern the overgrowth that clung to their surfaces, an unmistakable sign of a city reclaimed by the very landscape it once stood upon. Nolan, in his awe, realized he was indeed inside the Bentham anomaly. This was no ordinary habitat. It was a world unto itself, a beautiful and surreal ecosystem. Nolan wrapped his arm around Grace, offering support as she limped toward the shore. She moved slowly, each step labored. Blood, a stark contrast against the dark fabric of her uniform, oozed through a tear in her pant leg. The salt water lapped at their feet. The beach, bathed in the eerie light of this strange dawn, seemed surreal, a landscape of survival and despair. Ahead, the silhouette of Doyle became discernible, sitting next to Anika at the base of the dunes. He looked exhausted. As they approached, Nolan could see the surprise etched on Doyle's face. The scene was a somber gathering of survivors, each one carrying the weight of their recent ordeal. Nolan's gaze shifted between his crewmates, and he had a feeling that their trials were far from over. Chapter 4. Nolan stared up at the dense canopy of the coastal forest, his gaze fixed on the figure of Eva Martinez, dangling precariously from her ejection seat. The early morning sun cast dappled shadows on her face, highlighting the strain etched into her features. She was trapped, suspended 30 feet above the lush undergrowth of this unusual habitat they called the Bentham anomaly. The scene was almost surreal. Eva, an accomplished astronaut, now helplessly entangled in the embrace of a towering tree. The parachute that had saved her life from the crashing Ranger 4 now held her captive, its fabric and suspension lines twisted around a thick branch, far from the sturdy trunk. Eva's voice, laced with a mix of fear and frustration, cut through Nolan's contemplation. "Don't just stand there looking at me, Nolan," she called out. "Get me down." Nolan, momentarily lost in thought, responded. "Hang tight," he said, before realizing the irony of his words. A brief, tension-cutting laugh escaped him, despite the gravity of the situation. "It's not funny," Eva retorted, her voice strained. "From down here, it kind of is." Eva ignored his attempt at humor, tugging at the straps of her harness again, her movements growing more frantic. She had tried to free herself moments ago, but the restraints were unyielding, locked in place by the twisted metal of the seat. "That's not going to work." "Take a deep breath," Nolan said. She continued to pull at the straps, her focus singular. "There's a flaw in the seats." Nolan strained to examine her seat. "I noticed it when helping with Doyle's seat earlier. The ejection force warped the frame. Your harness release is jammed." Eva paused, her effort subsiding as she processed his words. "Did you see how bad Anika's injuries are?" she asked, concern lacing her voice. Nolan's expression darkened. They're serious. A piece of the hull crushed her legs, and there's metal stuck in her side. She's not conscious, just moaning. "Can't you just cut me down?" Eva asked, a note of desperation creeping into her voice. Nolan assessed the situation, his eyes tracing the path of the parachute up to the branch. "I don't think so. It's too risky. Even if we could get up the tree and out on the limb, there's no easy way to cut the whole parachute free. Plus, the chair could fall on you." Eva attempted to look up, her movements restricted. "If I keep spinning, I'm going to hurl." Nolan instinctively took a step back, considering their options. "We need to cut you out of the harness." "Just hurry up," Eva said, her patience wearing thin. "There's a survival kit in your seat. I think it has a knife," Nolan said, pointing towards the bottom of the spinning frame. "It's like a briefcase in a compartment below you. Can you reach it?" Eva leaned forward, straining against the confines of the harness. Her fingers stretched out, grasping at air, but the distance was too great, and the harness held her back. Nolan turned back towards the beach, where Doyle stood with Grace, who was tending to Anika's wounds. He called, "Doyle, did the emergency kit from your ejection seat have a knife in it?"
"What?"
Doyle shouted back, his hand cupped around his ear. Nolan raised his voice, competing with the relentless sound of the waves crashing onto the shore. "The survival kit you pulled from your ejection seat. If it had some kind of knife or saw, can you bring it over here?" Doyle patted his pocket and jogged up the dunes towards Nolan. In a matter of seconds, he stood in front of him, producing a folding metal pocket knife. He handed it to Nolan with a nod. Nolan glanced back at Anika, lying injured on the beach. Concern tinged his voice as he looked up at Eva, then down at the spiky palm bushes dotting the dunes below her. "That's a long way to drop, Doc. If you get impaled by these plants or break a leg, it's going to be bad news for Anika." Eva let out a groan of frustration. Nolan, deep in thought, proposed a plan. "What if we use the line from one of the other parachutes to give you something to climb down? Instead of jumping, you could slide down like a rope ladder." From the beach, Grace's voice reached them. "Whatever you're doing, Anika needs you to hurry it up." Nolan gave Doyle a determined look. "Go get the parachute line from your ejection seat." Doyle nodded and sprinted off towards the waterline, moving with purpose. Nolan held the folding knife in his hand, weighing its heft. "Get ready to catch it, okay?" He called up to Eva. He tossed the still-folded knife towards her, aiming carefully at her chair. Eva leaned out to grab it, but her movements were clumsy, and the knife slipped through her fingers, plummeting down into the brush. The failed attempt sent her chair spinning anew. Nolan heard Eva make a retching noise. He waited for the chair's spin to slow down. "Let's try again." This time, Eva extended her hands with more caution. Nolan tossed the knife with precision, and she caught it, clutching it tightly to her chest as her seat took on another spin. "Focus on cutting the lower straps first," Nolan said. "Save the ones around your shoulders for last. They're the ones holding you in." Eva unfolded the knife with a shaky hand and began to saw at the harness strap over her lap. The blade moved back and forth, biting into the tough fabric. "Do you see anything out there?" Nolan pointed beyond the beach, into the dense forest that blanketed the interior of the habitat. He hoped that Eva's elevated position might offer a better view than he had. "Like what?" Eva asked. Her voice strained as she continued sawing at the harness. "No one knows where Marcus went," Nolan said. Eva glanced at him briefly before returning her focus to the task at hand. "You saw him last night?" "He was standing right here, at the edge of the forest," Nolan said, gesturing towards the lush greenery. "And then, he just followed something into the jungle." Eva shook her head slightly. "I don't think I have a better vantage than you. The way the inside of this habitat curves up, it's all jungle, from what I can see." Nolan took a moment to survey their surroundings again, his gaze following the sweeping arc of the massive cylinder. The interior was a full, dense rainforest ecosystem, thriving within the confines of the habitat. Towering trees, thick underbrush, and the distant sound of unseen creatures filled the air. The sight was both awe-inspiring and disorienting. A wild, untamed world contained within the structure of engineering. The curvature of the cylinder created an illusion of endlessness, the forest appearing to loop endlessly upon itself. "There's nothing else nearby? Nothing he'd be moving towards?" Nolan said. "Everything I see nearby just looks like a rainforest," Eva replied, her attention still on the harness. "And the ruins of that city seem way too far away." Doyle appeared, grunting under the weight of the entire parachute as he hauled it up the dunes. He laid it out on the sand, just outside the spiky underbrush. Nolan immediately set to work, braiding 3 of the parachute lines together into a makeshift rope. His hands moved quickly, expertly tying the strands. Doyle watched, squinting. "Why waste your time with that? Can't we just toss it up like it is?" "It's strong enough," Nolan replied without looking up. "But she needs something to hold on to." "I got through it," Eva called down, a note of triumph in her voice. "Everything's cut free except the straps on my shoulders." Nolan finished the last knot on his makeshift rope and began tying large knots at intervals along its length. He stood up, coiled the line, and prepared to throw it up to her. "Here it comes," he announced, and with a smooth motion he tossed the rope up towards Eva. Now able to move more freely, Eva reached above her head and secured the rope to the top of her seat. Nolan tugged on it firmly, ensuring it was fastened securely. Eva resumed sawing at the final straps. "Wrap the rope around you first," Nolan said. She followed his direction, winding the rope around her waist. Moments later, the final strap gave way. She quickly tucked the folded knife into her pocket and balanced on the edge of the seat, poised to slide down the rope. "Wait!" Nolan's voice cut through the air, halting Eva in her precarious position. "Don't forget the survival kit." With a sigh, Eva steadied herself on the rope. She took a deep breath and swung out, her leg wrapping around the rope to anchor herself. Her movements were clumsy but determined as she reached towards the bottom of the ejection chair. The task was daunting, trying to manipulate the release mechanism of the survival kit while hanging. The seat and rope began to spin again, throwing off her balance. She lost her grip momentarily, her hands flailing before regaining their hold. "Everything's spinning. I can't see straight," she called down, her voice laced with panic. With a final desperate tug, the latch released. The survival kit, liberated from its confines, plummeted to the ground with a dull thud. Eva, still spinning, attempted to lower herself down the rope. About 20 feet off the ground, her grip faltered. The rope slipped through her fingers and she fell. Time seemed to slow as Nolan watched in horror, his heart in his throat. Eva's body twisted in the air. A look of fear etched on her face as she plummeted towards the ground. She landed with a jarring thud in the dunes, narrowly missing a sharp-edged palm bush. Nolan's relief at her avoidance of the bush was short-lived as he saw her struggle to stand. Her movements were unsteady, her body off balance. Without hesitation, he rushed to her side, grabbing her shoulders to steady her. Before he could ask if she was all right, Eva leaned forward and vomited uncontrollably, her sickness splattering onto Nolan's boots. Eva looked up at him, her face flushed with embarrassment and guilt. "Oh, man. I'm so sorry," she exclaimed, her voice weak. Doyle, who had approached the scene, clapped Nolan on the shoulder, a mischievous glint in his eye. "No good deed goes unpunished, right, hotshot?" Eva, regaining some semblance of balance, took a cautious step. As her dizziness seemed to pass, she rushed down the dunes towards where Anika lay. Nolan, meanwhile, looked down at his boots with a grimace. Using his toes, he stepped out of them, the vomit making a squelching sound as he did so. He picked up the soiled boots and started walking towards the surf, each step leaving a mark in the soft sand of the dunes. As he approached the water, the waves lapped gently at the shore. The habitat, with its dense rainforest and mysteries, loomed large in Nolan's mind. He rinsed his boots in the surf, the water washing away the remnants of their ordeal. He looked back at the dunes, where Doyle was helping Eva make her way to Anika. In the distance, the dense jungle seemed to beckon. Chapter 5. 2 days before the crash of Ranger 4. Nolan Beckett glided down the narrow corridor of Frontier 2, his movements in zero-G unfamiliar. The absence of gravity felt surreal, like an eternal free fall, yet there was no ground to meet. As he moved, his body twisted, adapting to the weightlessness that turned every gentle push into a slow, gliding motion. He paused, detouring towards a nearby window, a small porthole into the cosmos. The bold white lettering, Argo, was stenciled along the smooth metallic paneling of the spacecraft, next to the designation, Frontier 2. Nolan steadied himself, placing his hands on either side of the window, the cool surface grounding him momentarily. Outside, the vastness of space stretched to infinity, a tapestry of stars against the void. He peered into the distance, searching for any sign of the Bentham anomaly, their mission's destination. Yet, all that greeted him was the endless expanse of the universe, a mesmerizing yet daunting sight. Just stars, space, and the profound silence of the cosmos. A fog lingered in his mind, a residual haziness from his prolonged sleep. He tried to shake it off, reminding himself that he was waking up from a 6-month slumber in suspended animation. The thought felt surreal, almost dreamlike. Nolan's gaze drifted to the Apocara watch clasped around his wrist, its face illuminated in the spacecraft's subdued light. 6 months in suspended animation, a half-year adrift in the silent expanse of space. And yet, time had not stood still. The watch, a cherished memento from his piloting days in the Vietnam War, showed a time and date that refused to align with the ship's chronology. Odd, he thought, given Precarious' reputation for unwavering precision. But then again, this was space, an environment where the usual rules didn't always apply. He made a mental note to synchronize the watch with the ship's time system as soon as he arrived at his quarters. Nolan pushed off, continuing his exploration. His movements in zero gravity were still a learning curve, unsteady, yet improving with each motion. A miscalculated push sent him floating into another wall. He met it with a soft thud, steadied himself, and redirected down the corridor with a newfound sense of control. A shiver ran through him, an internal coldness that seemed to seep into his veins. He rubbed absently at the spot on his arm where an IV had been, pondering whether the chill was psychological or a lingering effect of the suspended animation. Frontier 2 felt vast from within, its corridors and modules sprawling out like a labyrinth of metal and technology. Nolan had memorized the layout before the mission, yet this was his first time experiencing it. Reality differed from the diagrams and briefings. He navigated a turn, entering a new section of the spacecraft. Above the hatch, the words "crew quarters" were stenciled on the bulkhead. The area had an industrial yet purposeful design, reminiscent of NASA's efficiency. Every inch of space was used, every surface and corner engineered for life in zero gravity. The central corridor opened onto 8 smaller doorways, symmetrically arranged around the outside of the space. Nolan drifted towards one at the end, his movements more confident now. Inside, he entered a compact living space, designed with the absence of gravity in mind. There was no traditional up or down here, only surfaces and volumes used in 3 dimensions. Nolan chuckled to himself, thinking that it resembled a high-tech camper, designed for the peculiarities of space. The communal area was modest but comfortable, a nod to the psychological need for a semblance of normalcy. A small port window at the far end offered a view of the stars. Next to this shared space were 3 personal sleeping pods, each a private sanctuary in the shared environment. They were stacked efficiently next to each other, their names stenciled on each: Coleridge, Frost, and in the middle, Beckett, Nolan's pod. It was his small corner in the vastness of space, a place he could call his own amid the infinite expanse. As Nolan floated there, taking in his new surroundings, a mix of awe and a sobering sense of responsibility settled over him. Alone in the crew quarters, Nolan floated into his designated pod. His eyes settled on the sleeping pad, a wall of soft Velcro that served as a bed in the zero-gravity environment. NASA had designed the material to interact with the fabric of the sleep suits, ensuring he wouldn't float away during rest. However, sleep was the furthest thing from his mind. The extended slumber of suspended animation had left him with a lingering restlessness, a deep-seated aversion to the thought of sleep. Opposite his bed, Nolan faced his personal computer terminal, a direct link to the spacecraft's central computer network. He pressed a button on the terminal, and the analog screen slowly faded to life. The screen, with its slightly curved glass and the soft hum of its cathode ray tube, illuminated the dim quarters with a pale, flickering light. The small monitor prominently displayed the current date and time in green digital numbers. 15:32:23 UTC, December 10th, 1983. He reached for the physical arrow buttons on the terminal. Each click navigated through the user interface, bringing him to the current day's audio mission log. One more click, and the recorded briefing began to play. As Nolan turned the dials on the side of his watch, adjusting it to the correct time, he listened to the briefing. Chapter 6. The audio recording crackled, a pixelated progress bar displayed on the terminal in front of Nolan. December 10th, 1983. Frontier 2. Daily Briefing. Argo Mission. Mission elapsed time, 192 days. This briefing marks about 6 months since our departure from Earth. We've traveled vast distances through space, and our mission, pivotal in the history of human space exploration, is proceeding as planned. It has been 2 years since NASA announced the discovery of the Bentham anomaly. This groundbreaking find by astronomer Jeremy Bentham radically shifted our understanding of possible life in the universe. The object's non-natural origin was evident, lacking typical celestial characteristics such as comet-like composition or asteroid-like reflectivity. Its elongated orbit, on a 5,400-year cycle intersecting Earth's path, suggested an artificial trajectory, hinting at an intelligent design. Initial analysis indicated a singular entity, but enhanced data revealed a more complex reality. The Bentham anomaly is a pair of tandem objects rotating in synchrony. Their purpose and origin remain our mission's primary interest. Frontier 2, alongside our sister ship, Frontier 1, is an integral part of the Argo program, designed for redundancy and comprehensive exploration. Frontier 1, having launched 33 days ahead of us, should have commenced its study of these objects a month ago. However, we've yet to receive any data from Frontier 1, a situation we're monitoring closely. As of today, we have revived all crew members from suspended animation. This process is vital for conserving resources and maintaining crew well-being during our extensive journey. Our ETA to the Bentham anomaly is approximately 36 hours. Upon arrival, we'll execute a meticulous analysis, focusing on its composition, structure, and any potential signs of extraterrestrial technology. Mission Coordinator Jeff Jacobs has outlined a detailed itinerary for this analysis, which includes Nolan, his watch set, reached up and turned off the briefing. He turned his gaze to a closed compartment next to the computer terminal. He reached out and slid it open, revealing a compartment labeled Personal Gear Locker. Inside, he had meticulously secured every item. Nothing left to chance during the tumultuous journey of liftoff and space travel. Velcro straps and magnetic holders kept everything in place, a design necessity within space life. He retrieved his leather-bound journal, its cover worn with use. Nolan opened it, finding its pages filled with not just written entries, but also various papers and thin objects stored between the leaves. As he sifted through them, several photographs slid out. In the first picture, Nolan sat at the controls of his Cessna airplane, his eyes scanning the horizon. Sunlight streamed through the cockpit, illuminating his sandy hair and the faint smile on his face. Behind him, the expansive blue sky merged with the ocean, forming a picturesque backdrop for an advertisement banner waving over the Florida beach. His relaxed posture conveyed a deep sense of ease and contentment, a man at home in the sky. He lingered on the next snapshot, which captured a candid, joyful moment. Nolan stood beside a woman, both laughing at something unseen, her sandy blonde hair caught in the ocean breeze. The waves crashed behind them, and seagulls circled in the air, a perfect snapshot of a happy memory. Nolan's expression softened as he looked at it, a mix of longing and nostalgia washing over him. He turned the photo over, reading the inscription in purple ink. "Happy birthday, my love, May 1982. His fingers traced the words before he tucked the photograph into a pocket on the front of his uniform, close to his heart. Next, Nolan picked up a small piece of coral, turning it over in his hands. The rough texture contrasted with the smoothness of everything in the spacecraft, grounding him in a memory of Earth. His gaze then shifted to a paperback copy of The Old Man and the Sea by Ernest Hemingway. He set it aside along with a Nikon camera, revealing what lay behind it. It was a small metal tin, sturdy and handcrafted, the size of an Altoids container, but with an unmistakable aura of personal significance. The metal was worn, the paint distressed, and the material had been repurposed from something else into this small, precious box. Nolan unfastened the small latch and opened the lid. Inside the lid, an inscription was etched with care. "Don't lose the tune." It was a phrase that resonated with him, a reminder of both his passion for music and the resilience needed in life's journey. Soft foam lined the inside of the tin, precisely molded to fit an object, a few inches long, rectangular. But the space was empty, the object it was meant to protect conspicuously absent. His brow furrowed in confusion and concern. Nolan's finger lingered over the empty space in the foam, his face creased with confusion as he rummaged through the rest of his belongings. The blues mixtapes and Walkman, the rolls of camera film, and even the stash of Apollo chocolate bars. It seemed like everything else was there. The empty tin gnawed at him. He knew this was the first time he had taken out the box since entering suspended animation. A soft chime interrupted his train of thought. A small light blinked on the communications panel next to the locker, showing an incoming call. Someone was trying to reach him directly. Nolan pushed away from the locker, floating towards the panel. He pressed the button, and the voice of Commander Jake Reynolds crackled through the intercom system. "Nolan, this is Commander Reynolds." The voice came through, clear and authoritative. "I'm glad you're awake. Can you please make your way to Galley A? There's something we need to discuss." Chapter 7. Moments later, Nolan, floating in the modest crew galley designed for 10, pushed himself gently towards an outer wall to make space. The atmosphere was tense, filled with a mix of curiosity and unease. 5 other crew members had also gathered, each wearing expressions of uncertainty, clearly unaware of the reason behind this summons. "So, you're the lucky lottery winner," remarked a woman, breaking the silence. She had a straightforward manner about her. "I'm Anika." "Yeah, I guess you could say that," Nolan replied, his tone showing he didn't feel particularly lucky at the moment. "There were a lot of people who wanted your spot on the mission," Anika noted, her voice tinged with a mixture of respect and curiosity. Nolan simply nodded, his thoughts momentarily drifting to the unlikely series of events that led him here. "I'm still not sure how I ended up being selected." "Well, you must have had a heck of an application. I heard they—" Anika trailed off as Commander Jake Reynolds entered the room. His presence commanded immediate attention, and the surrounding conversation ceased abruptly. "Thank you for coming," Commander Reynolds said, propelling himself towards a screen built into the wall panel. He tapped a button, and the screen flickered to life, the Argo logo prominently displayed. "We're approaching the Bentham anomaly," Reynolds said. He pressed another button, and the logo gave way to a grainy image. "Our sensors have confirmed what NASA suspected. It's actually 2 objects tied together, not one." The image zoomed in, revealing the massive cylindrical objects spinning in unison, their details obscured by static and distance. "But we're actually here to talk about Frontier 1, Reynolds added, his tone shifting. Another press of the button, and the screen displayed a speck next to the cylinders, gradually enlarging into an indistinct shape. "We haven't been able to contact Frontier 1. No comms, no connection to our computer networks, and most strange, from what we can tell, their systems are completely powered down into a low power state." A heavy silence enveloped the room as the crew processed this information. The implications were ominous, and a sense of foreboding settled over the group. A tall, gruff man spoke up. "What about the people over there?" His voice was rough, like gravel. "We don't know, Mr. Doyle," Commander Reynolds replied, his expression grim. It was Anika who jumped in next, her voice laced with urgency. "Sir, does this have anything to do with our inability to contact Earth?" Commander Reynolds's gaze snapped to Anika, sharp and reprimanding. "That is not something we've shared with the crew yet," he said. His eyes then swept across the room, addressing everyone present. "What Ms. Patel just revealed needs to stay confidential within this group. And to answer your question, there are no indications the situations are related." "And why do I sense you have an assignment for us?" Doyle said, his eyes fixed on Commander Reynolds with a mix of skepticism and readiness. "I do," Reynolds affirmed, his tone steady and commanding. "We're about a day away from arriving at the Bentham anomaly. While our other teams will continue with their planned analysis of the objects, I'm sending the 6 of you to Frontier 1. He tapped the button on the screen again, and the image shifted dramatically, revealing a modest-sized shuttle with much clearer resolution. "This is Ranger 4, he continued. "You all will take it over to report back on the status within Frontier 1. Grace, you'll pilot with Nolan as your backup. Doyle, you and Marcus will investigate the systems. Anika, your job is to figure out why their comms are turned off. And Ava, you're to be there in case there's anyone who needs medical attention." The crew members nodded in unison. The mission was clear, yet the unknowns it presented cast a shadow of uncertainty over them. "Okay, we're adjourned. Go prepare for the mission. This will be a top priority as soon as we're in range." Reynolds's words were final, signaling the end of the meeting. The crew filed out of the hatch, each lost in their own thoughts about the upcoming mission. Nolan lingered, a question burning in his mind. "Commander, a word?" Commander Reynolds nodded, allowing the others to pass by. The room's atmosphere felt even more charged once they were gone, the weight of their conversation magnified in the emptiness. "What is it, Beckett?" Reynolds asked. Nolan hesitated for a moment, gathering his thoughts. "I was wondering, sir," he began cautiously. "Well, I'm probably the least qualified to be here. All I did was win a lottery and get a free ride. I understand why you'd choose the others, but my only qualification for being here is winning a glorified popularity contest." Commander Reynolds shook his head, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Really, Nolan? Is that why you think we selected you?" Nolan shrugged, his eyes betraying the insecurity he felt among these seasoned professionals. "I've read your file," Reynolds said, his tone shifting to one of seriousness. "No one else has survived anything like what you encountered in Vietnam. I didn't pick you for this mission because of a contest. I picked you because of what you did. Because you're a survivor. And you're probably the most resourceful person on this entire ship." Chapter 8. 5 hours before the crash of Ranger 4. The following day, Nolan approached the bulkhead leading to the airlock, with Ranger 4 waiting beyond. In the circular chamber of the airlock, he drifted towards one of the small windows, his gaze drawn outside. The Bentham anomaly loomed large and enigmatic in the void. He pulled in close to the glass, his eyes widening in awe. The sheer size of the cylinders was staggering, dwarfing the spacecraft and its crew. He considered the incredible feat of engineering it would take to construct such structures. Nolan observed the massive cylinders, composed of a vast metal framework, enveloping what appeared to be an outer shell of stone and debris. He had expected a design predominantly of metal, but it appeared the metal framework was holding something much more ancient in place. To him, the incredible structure resembled the surface of a long, rugged asteroid, a cosmic mystery constructed of stone and metal. His eyes studied the surface of the Bentham anomaly, wondering what lay inside. Reports suggested they were rotating habitats with artificial gravity, but the nature of the environment they supported remained a mystery. There were endless possibilities. Nolan's hand drifted unconsciously to his breast pocket, touching the photograph tucked inside. It was a reflexive gesture, seeking comfort in the familiar as he faced the unknown. Anika's voice pulled him from his reverie. "It's almost time. We need to get strapped in," she called from the airlock chamber. Following her back into the airlock, Nolan asked, "Is everyone else here?" Anika, securing the thick hatch behind them, said, "Yes, settled in and ready to go." Nolan didn't feel settled at all. His stomach fluttered with jitters. He propelled himself through the airlock and into Ranger 4. The interior of the shuttle-like spacecraft was utilitarian, functional, and compact. Towards the back was a large cargo bay, and he floated through a crew compartment where the others had already strapped in. Nolan navigated through a wide opening into the cockpit. Grace glanced back at him as he maneuvered into the co-pilot's seat beside her. The controls were familiar from his training, but sitting behind them now, in the reality of their mission, felt surreal. Never in his wildest dreams had he expected to be in this position. With the final tap of a button, Grace completed the pre-flight check. She turned to Nolan, her expression a mix of professionalism and underlying excitement. "All right, the pre-flight check is complete. Are you ready to go?" "Well, this is a far cry from towing banners with my Cessna over the Florida coastline," Nolan said. "But yeah, I'm ready to go." Grace's fingers danced over the control panel with practiced ease. "Frontier 2, this is Ranger 4. We are ready for departure," she said. The response crackled through the comm system. "Ranger 4, this is Frontier 2. You are clear for departure. Safe travels." With a nod, Grace initiated the decoupling sequence. Nolan braced himself in his seat, feeling the subtle vibrations of the spacecraft. There was a gentle bump, a physical confirmation of their detachment, followed by a tranquility that only space could offer. Through the windscreen of Ranger 4, Frontier 2 loomed. Its lights glowed against the backdrop of space, life, and activity bustling within. As they backed away, Nolan watched the ship diminish in size, the bustling motion behind its windows becoming distant. "Frontier 2, we are clear of your perimeter, initiating thrusters for course adjustment," Grace reported. The scene outside the windscreen shifted as Grace banked the Ranger 4. For a moment, their trajectory arced across the awe-inspiring view of the Bentham anomaly, their massive cylindrical forms dominating the vista. And then, in the center of their windscreen, emerged the silhouette of Frontier 1. On the surface, it was identical to Frontier 2, but it gave Nolan an unnerving feeling. Devoid of the lively glow of lights, it was a silent, lifeless shadow set against the grandeur of the Bentham anomaly. The ship sat still and unsettling in the eerie darkness, heightening the sense of unease. Nolan felt the shift as Grace engaged another set of thrusters, propelling them towards Frontier 1. The silhouette of the dormant spacecraft grew larger in the windscreen, filling their view with its imposing presence. The 6 crew members inside Ranger 4 were silent, each lost in their own thoughts as they approached the mysteries held within Frontier 1. Chapter 9. 4 hours after the crash of Ranger 4. "What do you mean that we have to swim back down to the wreckage?" Doyle's voice was a mix of incredulity and irritation. "You're crazy if you think I'm going down there, Captain Nemo." Nolan's gaze drifted towards where Eva was performing some sort of triage on Anika's legs, her movements frantic but precise. He turned back to Doyle, his expression serious. "The medical supplies and the survival kits aren't meant for those kinds of injuries." "I think you're forgetting the monster eels," Doyle said, jabbing his finger toward Grace, who was sitting some distance away. "Her leg looks like it's been through a meat grinder." Even from 20 paces away, Nolan could see the ominous red lines of infection creeping up and down Grace's leg. But admitting fear or doubt to Doyle was not an option. He needed Doyle's help, and showing any hesitation would only reinforce Doyle's reluctance. Nolan turned towards the array of items he had laid out in the dunes. It was a makeshift collection, survival kit contents, pieces scavenged from the wreckage that had washed ashore. a visual representation of their dire situation. "This is all we have between us," Nolan said, gesturing towards the items. "Have for what?" Doyle asked. "To live off of. I don't think anyone is coming to get us, not anytime soon." "Of course they're coming to get us. Look around. There's no way for them to get into this habitat even if they knew where we were. They're not going to abandon us." "No, but if they have their own problems..." Nolan trailed off, deliberately changing the subject. "There are a few things we need. First, and most importantly, Eva needs the medical kit. Then, we need a stronger radio. The ones in the survival kits are glorified walkie-talkies. Finally, we need the rations. The current supplies won't last for all 6 of us. Not beyond a day." "6 of us?" Doyle laughed, bitter. "You might as well count Marcus out. Who knows if he's even alive out there in the jungle of mysteries." "So you'll come?" "Heck no." Doyle's jaw tightened. "Not unless you have a plan for those eels." Nolan reached down and picked up a long plastic tube. "Actually, I do." He held up the tube, revealing it to be an emergency flare. "This is bright, and eels hate light," he said, his voice confident. It was a bluff. Nolan didn't know if the eels had an aversion to light, but he needed Doyle to believe him. The creatures they had encountered in the dark waters were used to the absence of light, and Nolan was banking on the hope that the sudden brightness would be disorienting, even painful to their dark-adjusted eyes. "You're sure about this?" Doyle said. "Absolutely." Nolan watched Doyle carefully, gauging his reaction. He knew Doyle was scared, they all were, but he also suspected that Doyle's bravado masked a deeper sense of responsibility. Nolan needed to tap into that, to turn Doyle's fear into action. "We can't just sit here and hope for a rescue that might never come," Nolan said, his voice firm. "We have to take our survival into our own hands." Doyle looked at Nolan, then back towards the others. Nolan saw conflict in his eyes and decided to push a bit more. "We need those supplies, Doyle. And we're the only ones who can get them. Without them, our chances drop to nearly 0. Doyle's eyes wandered over to where Anika lay bleeding. Then his gaze shifted back to the small pile of supplies. A moment of silence hung between them, charged with the weight of their predicament. Then with a heavy sigh, Doyle's resistance seemed to crumble. "It's suicide, but okay, count me in." Chapter 10. About an hour later, Nolan and Doyle were treading water in the sea above the sunken remains of the Ranger 4. The wreckage lay below, sunken in the silent depths. Each man clutched an emergency flare and a makeshift spear, crafted by Nolan for protection from the monstrous eels. Nolan cast a glance back towards the beach. He could see Grace standing there, her figure tense and watchful, while Eva remained kneeled beside Anika, stitching up her wounds. "She's not getting any better while we practice our synchronized swimming out here," Doyle remarked. "Okay," Nolan responded, holding his flare above his head. "Are you good with the plan?" "Good? Heck no. But I know what to do." Nolan nodded, acknowledging Doyle's apprehension. He struck the cap of his flare, watching as it erupted into a radiant flame, casting an unnatural reflection across the sea's surface. Doyle followed suit, and together they watched as the bright light of their flares pierced the watery gloom. They took deep, measured breaths to fill their lungs to capacity and dove beneath the waves, plunging into the depths towards the wreckage of the Ranger 4. As they descended, the water was clear of the silt that had clouded Nolan's view on his previous dive. The hulking wreck of Ranger 4 was resting on the ocean floor, a ghostly shell of its former self. Its once sleek exterior was now marred and twisted, bearing the scars of its violent descent. A large, jagged hole gaped in its side, like a wound exposing the ship's interior. The light from their flares, far more intense than what Nolan had on his previous dive, cast an eerie glow around them. It seemed to keep the monstrous eels at bay, but Nolan could feel their presence lurking in the shadows, watching, waiting. He led the way through the hole in the hull's side, the flare's light throwing nightmarish shadows across the sunken interior. Their surroundings were a maze of twisted metal and broken components, a labyrinthine grave. True to their plan, Nolan swam towards the back of the crew cabin. He reached the airlock area, setting to work on an EVA suit. His movements were swift and precise as he buckled and sealed the empty suit. Once the EVA suit was sealed, Nolan activated the oxygen supply. He watched as the suit inflated, its limbs filling with life-giving air. With a practiced motion, he used the sharp edge of his spear to create a small gash in each arm of the suit. Air spurted out in controlled bursts. He and Doyle each pressed their mouths to a separate hole on either side of the suit. Nolan felt the rush of air filling his mouth and breathed it into his lungs. The sensation was odd, yet life-sustaining. It took a moment to adjust to the rhythm of breathing through the makeshift apparatus. With their lungs replenished from the improvised air supply, Nolan and Doyle exchanged a determined glance before parting ways. Doyle made his way toward the cargo bay, while Nolan propelled himself into the mangled cockpit of the Ranger 4. The devastation was extensive. The impact had crushed and distorted the entire front end of the spacecraft. Nolan moved with caution, feeling underneath the control panel for the removable beacon. His heart sank when he found it missing. The prospect of having to return for more air loomed over him, a silent countdown to urgency. Just as he contemplated going back, his eyes caught sight of the beacon. The crash had jarred it loose, and it now lay towards the rear of the cockpit. Thankfully, it appeared intact. He grabbed it and swam back to the EVA suit. Nolan pressed his mouth against the gash in the suit's arm, taking a deep breath, the air a welcome respite to his burning lungs. The bizarre sensation of drawing breath from the suit made him feel like some kind of underwater vampire. His eyes scanned the surroundings for Doyle, concern mounting. If Doyle hadn't returned for air yet, he would soon be in dire straits. Nolan placed the beacon next to the EVA suit, took a large breath, and set off in the direction Doyle had gone. As he swam, a sudden sense of movement in the surrounding water spiked his adrenaline. Fearing an eel, he brandished the flare, casting its light in a sweeping arc. His fear morphed into dread when he realized it wasn't an eel, but the wreckage itself shifting around him. Ahead in the cargo bay, Doyle was wrestling with the medical kit, which was wedged under debris. His movements were frantic, desperate. Unbeknownst to him, his efforts were causing the entire ship to tremble. Unseen by Doyle, Nolan approached and tapped his shoulder. Doyle jerked around in surprise, narrowly missing Nolan with a wild swing of his fist. Nolan gestured for calm with a patting gesture, trying to communicate the need for careful movements. He pointed out the shifting debris, pieces of the ship now dislodging and floating down around them. Nolan mimed, sucking through a straw, pointing back toward the EVA suit, signaling Doyle to go back for air. Doyle, understanding, nodded and pointed back at the lodged medical kit. Nolan took over the task, discarding the brute force approach. Instead, he used another piece of debris as a lever, prying the way clear. The medical kit, about the size of a large suitcase, came free in his hands. Nolan noticed Doyle reappearing with a look of deep concern etched on his face. Doyle pointed around at the hull of the Ranger 4, now unstable. Nolan nodded in agreement and watched as Doyle headed back to the cargo bay for the rations. Nolan moved to the EVA suit, setting down his spear and the medical supplies before inhaling more air. A sudden movement in his peripheral vision startled him. He turned, expecting Doyle, but his gaze fell upon one of the monstrous eels slithering through the hole in the hull. In a reflexive panic, Nolan jerked backwards, colliding with the opposite side of the ship. The impact was minimal, but in the fragile state of the wreckage, it was enough. With a groan of stressed metal, the Ranger 4 shifted, ominous creaks filling the water. Horror struck Nolan as he witnessed large fragments of the wreckage tumbling down around the hole in the hull, blocking their exit. They would have to leave through the smashed cockpit windscreen. In the chaos, his flare slipped from his grasp, tumbling away into a pile of debris, unreachable. Nolan's eyes darted around, searching for the eel, and he saw it gliding toward the cargo bay. Doyle reappeared from the back of the ship, his gestures frantic. He used his flare to point back the way he had come, his expression one of alarm. Suddenly the eel, close on Doyle's heels, darted forward with menacing speed. Nolan, acting on instinct, used his spear to stab at the creature, fending it off. Doyle, now aware of the debris blocking their escape, was panicking. Nolan jabbed the spear toward the eel again, its teeth gnashing in the dim light. He signaled to Doyle to get more air while he held off the creature. Nolan gestured, showing that they needed to grab what they had and leave. But Doyle, in a frenzy, shook his head. He hadn't secured the rations yet. Nolan grabbed the medical supplies and thrust the boxy radio beacon into Doyle's hands. Turning, he swam up towards the cockpit, hoping Doyle would follow. With the eel lurking in the shadows below them, Nolan wanted out of there. In the cockpit, Nolan's movements were calculated and swift as he thrust the medical supplies through the broken windscreen. He remembered his previous experience and proceeded with caution, ensuring nothing caught on the jagged edges. In the moment's urgency, each second felt like an eternity. Outside the Ranger, more eels were swarming, their sinister forms undulating in the murky water, ready to strike. Nolan's heart pounded as he plunged his arm back into the cockpit, his fingers closing around the shaft of his spear. With a quick motion, he brandished the weapon, swinging it at the encroaching eels. Their teeth were inches from him, their aggression heightened by the chaos. He gestured to Doyle as he emerged with the remaining flare. Its light, a beacon in the underwater gloom, cast a brilliant glow, forcing the eels to recoil and retreat. The flare's radiance pushed back the darkness and the danger lurking within it. With the medical supplies and radio secured, Nolan and Doyle knew it was now or never. They kicked off from the wreckage, propelling themselves towards the surface. The surrounding water was a tumult, but their focus was singular: escape. As they ascended, the surface neared, and the mangled remains of the Ranger 4 receded into the depths. Chapter 11. 3 hours before the crash of Ranger 4. Docking is complete, Grace announced from her pilot's seat in the cockpit of the Ranger 4. The airlock is secure and clear to open. One by one, the 6 crew members unbuckled their harnesses, each moving with a mix of urgency and caution. Anika, with practiced efficiency, floated towards the airlock compartment. Her movements were precise as she disengaged the safety mechanisms and checked the pressure equalization. The rest of the crew gathered, forming a loose circle in the cabin's weightlessness. Grace glanced at her watch. "Let's split up, but stay in your pairs," she instructed. "We won't be able to communicate using the internal intercom systems until Anika and Eva reactivate them on the bridge." Marcus asked, "What about staying in touch with Frontier 2? Grace replied, "Once you and Nolan restore the power systems, Anika can activate that from the bridge too." She paused, thinking. "Until then, Ranger 4 is our only way to contact them. We owe them regular updates every 90 minutes. As Anika cranked open the seals on the airlock door, it swung inward. A sound, unexpected and out of place, reached their ears. "What is that?" Doyle asked. "I think it's music," Nolan responded, baffled. Anika pulled the hatch all the way open, and the music blared, pulsating out of the darkness inside Frontier 1. It was so loud they couldn't hear each other speaking, the pounding rhythm and soaring vocals of rock and roll filling the surrounding space. Anika flipped on a flashlight and pointed to a compartment in the wall. "Everyone take one," she yelled over the music. The crew members, one by one, floated through the airlock and into the darkness of Frontier 1. Nolan swept his flashlight up and down the hallways in front of them, the beam cutting through the gloom. An odd feeling of déjà vu struck him. He tried to convince himself it was because they had just come from Frontier 2, which had an identical layout. But it felt like something more. A sense of familiarity tinged with an inexplicable unease. Eva, having floated further down the corridor, was still just within sight. She called something back to the rest of the group, her voice lost in the overpowering music. Realizing her words were inaudible, she pushed off a wall and glided back towards them in the zero gravity. The song paused for a moment as it reached its end, the silence in the spacecraft almost more jarring than the music. Then it began again. the opening notes echoing through the corridors. It's on repeat, Nolan thought, a sense of wonder mixed with unease washing over him. He listened more closely to the song now, trying to place it. The rhythm was compelling, driven by piercing electric guitar riffs and layered with a haunting, ethereal synthesizer. Although unfamiliar to Nolan, its sheer power was undeniable. Over the noise of the music, Eva called, "It's coming out of every speaker." She raised her voice as the lyrics of the song filled the surrounding space. "If I could throw this lifeless lifeline to the wind, leave this heart of clay, see you walk away into the night." Marcus, noticing the others drifting away, tapped Nolan on the shoulder to regain his focus. Using hand motions, he showed that the other pairs had headed to their assigned tasks. He gestured for Nolan to hurry, leading the way through the spacecraft. They floated through the empty corridors of Frontier 1, their flashlights the only sources of light, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Nolan glimpsed Frontier 2 through a port window, glowing vibrantly in the darkness of space. The song continued to swell through the speakers, the bass line both melodic and driving. "If I could, through myself, set your spirit free, I'd lead your heart away, see you break away into the light." They navigated the dark, empty corridors, descending towards the lower decks. Soon, they arrived outside a bulkhead labeled Engineering Bay. Marcus manipulated the latch mechanism, opening the hatch, and floated inside, his flashlight beam sweeping across the room. Nolan followed, the music still blaring inside, the expressive guitars and vocals building to a crescendo. He now recognized it as U2, but the song was unfamiliar to him. This desperation, dislocation, separation, condemnation, revelation and temptation, isolation, desolation, let it go. Marcus, frustrated with Nolan's momentary distraction, shone his flashlight into Nolan's eyes, snapping him back to the task at hand. "Pay attention," he yelled, over-enunciating the words to ensure Nolan understood. Nolan watched as Marcus flipped a switch on a panel stenciled with Reactor Control Console. Nothing happened. The panel remained dark, unresponsive to their attempts to awaken it. Using the beam of his flashlight, Marcus guided Nolan's attention to another console on the far side of the engineering bay. He floated towards it, unsure of what to do once he got there. As he approached the station labeled Auxiliary Systems, the purpose of his task became clear. The console was an array of dim gauges and switches, its design a blend of analog ruggedness and basic digital technology. Under a gauge labeled Backup Battery Status, Nolan noted that the ship's backup batteries were operating at 63% capacity. A series of switches lay next to it, each corresponding to different systems within the spacecraft. With a tentative hand, Nolan flipped the switch next to Engineering Bay, causing the lights in the room to flicker to life. The dormant computer systems around them began booting up with a series of beeps and whirs. Marcus shot Nolan a thumbs up before turning his attention back to the reactor control console. Nolan skimmed down the list of other systems. One by one, he activated the bridge systems, communications network, and life support controls. The other teams had split up, going to these sections of the ship. Each flip of a switch brought another relevant system back online. As Bono's voice reached a crescendo in the song, Nolan found himself lost in the lyrics. "I'm wide awake. I'm wide awake." Without warning, Marcus's yell pierced the music, snapping Nolan back to reality. "Nolan!" Wide awake. Nolan pushed off the nearest wall, floating towards Marcus, a look of deep concern etching his features. "I'm not sleeping. Oh, no, no, no." As Nolan arrived at Marcus's side, the music ceased without warning, leaving them in an unsettling silence. Marcus tapped the now glowing screen in front of him with a mix of disbelief and frustration. "It's gone," Marcus said, his voice tense. "What is?" Nolan asked, peering at the screen. "The music?" "No, the nuclear reactor," Marcus said. "The whole thing is gone." Chapter 12. Nolan and Marcus moved through the corridors of Frontier 1, their path now illuminated by the lights. The eerie silence of the ship was now punctuated by the soft hum of systems coming back to life. Moments earlier, Anika's voice had crackled over the intercom from the bridge, her tone urgent as she beckoned them to join her. She had been cryptic about her reasons, insisting on speaking in person. Nolan, leading the way, rounded a corner and collided with Grace. In the zero gravity, their bodies tumbled off in different directions, careening into the corridor walls. Nolan steadied himself against a bulkhead, his heart racing from the unexpected encounter. Marcus and Doyle darted up to join them, their expressions a mix of surprise and concern. "What are you doing out here?" Nolan asked Grace, still catching his breath. "I could ask you the same. We can't do anything more with life support until you power on the nuclear reactor." Nolan exchanged a glance with Marcus, an unspoken communication passing between them. "It's gone," Marcus said. "We checked the logs. There weren't any signs of malfunctions, but someone manually initiated the procedure to eject the nuclear core." "Why would someone do that?" Grace asked. "I don't know," Marcus said. "But when the juice in the batteries is gone, that's it. There's no way on board to recharge them." Nolan explained why they were headed to the bridge, recounting Anika's mysterious call. Before they could continue, Grace interjected, "First, you need to see something." She gestured for Nolan to follow her. They floated near the center of the ship, where the crew quarters were located. Grace slowed outside the main area of the living spaces and gestured inside. Peering in, the sight took Nolan by surprise. Someone had been living there, but not as part of a crew. He saw that someone had rearranged the space to resemble a single-family home. Items from around Frontier 1 had been repurposed into household objects. A makeshift bookshelf was assembled in one corner, fashioned out of storage shelves from elsewhere in the spacecraft. An exercise bike had been lugged in and strapped to a bulkhead. Personal items, likely gathered from other quarters, were arranged in a manner that suggested an attempt at creating a cozy, lived-in space. One room near the front of the crew quarters caught Nolan's attention. Inside, a variety of children's toys floated in the zero gravity, an assortment of colors and shapes suspended in the air. The sight was out of place, evoking a sense of surreal domesticity within the spacecraft. He was about to comment on the peculiar scene when Grace spoke up. "That's not even the strangest thing." She gestured further down the corridor. Following her lead, Nolan's eyes widened in astonishment. Just beyond Grace, he saw an upright piano strapped to the inner wall of the corridor, its presence as surreal as it was unexpected. "Are you serious?" Nolan said. Grace nodded, her expression mirroring Nolan's bewilderment. Marcus, having floated up behind Nolan, said, "Where did it come from? How did it even get in here?" Compelled by curiosity, Nolan approached the piano and folded back the fallboard, revealing the keys. Tentatively, he rested his fingers on a G minor 4 chord and pressed down. The gentle force of his action pushed him backwards in the zero gravity, while the beautiful notes resonated through the piano, their sound echoing down the corridors. "It looks like it's been here for ages," Nolan said, trailing off. On the bottom of the fallboard, someone had scratched a phrase into the wood. "Don't lose the tune." A chill ran down Nolan's spine. "How is any of this possible?" he said under his breath. Grace, who had moved further down the corridor, gestured towards a storage bay. "Come look in here," she said. Nolan tore his attention away from the piano and followed Marcus into the room, normally used for storing supplies for the crew quarters. Compartments lined all the walls of the room, each filled with storage containers. "What?" Nolan asked, perplexed, as he looked around the storage bay. "I don't see anything out of place in here." "Open one," Grace said. Marcus reached for a container that was about the size of a large cooler. He unhooked it, peeling off the lid with a gentle tug in the zero gravity. He tilted it towards them. "It's dirt," Marcus said. "It's completely filled with soil." "There are dozens of those bins," Grace said, her gaze sweeping across the room, "and every single one is packed with dirt." Nolan furrowed his brow, trying to make sense of it. "Is that part of the equipment manifest?" From outside the room, Doyle chimed in, his voice echoing in the corridor. Nope, there's no reason for it. Why waste the space? Before anyone could respond, a pleasant chime resonated through the ship's speakers, followed by Anika's voice. Marcus, Nolan, if you can hear me, where are you? Nolan floated over to the nearest intercom panel and pressed the button. We're coming, he assured her. We ran into Grace and Doyle. We'll all be there in just a moment. He paused, his eyes still fixed on the containers full of dirt. There's something very strange going on with this ship. Yeah, Anika's voice crackled back through the intercom. You better hurry up here so we can show you what we found on the bridge. Chapter 13. Nolan floated through a wide bulkhead and into the bridge of Frontier 1. He paused for a moment, absorbing his surroundings. This was unfamiliar territory for him, as his role on the mission had never required a visit to the bridge of Frontier 2. The room was a utilitarian use of space, brimming with buttons, knobs, screens, and dials. The room had a circular layout, with 5 stations spread out around the circumference of the room. Various control panels and monitors were equipped at each station, all designed with pragmatic style. 2 enormous windows at the top of the room offered a breathtaking view of space. The puzzling shapes of the Bentham anomaly filled the vista, imposing and mysterious. Anika sat in a chair at one of the stations, a keyboard pulled out, her fingers clacking at the keys. All right, Anika, Doyle said. Have you figured out what's really happening here on board the SS Twilight Zone? Anika, absorbed in her work, gestured towards Eva without looking up. Hang on, look at what Eva's got at her station first. Marcus, I need your help with something. Their attention shifted to Eva, who was sitting at a console on the opposite side of the room. Grace glanced down at her watch. We're overdue for our check-in with Frontier 2. They're going to worry if we don't make contact soon. Wait a second. Let me show you this first, Eva said. She gestured towards the console in front of her. As soon as the power came online, I tried to figure out how to turn off that incessant music. She tapped a few keys. The first thing I noticed was that someone had rerouted all controls to the crew quarters. Nolan and Grace exchanged a look as he thought about the rearranged crew quarters they had just left. Eva continued. I overrode those controls and shut off the music, but when I did, I saw this. She tapped the screen again, drawing their attention. What? I don't see anything, Grace said, peering closer. Read it more closely, Eva said. Nolan leaned in, scanning the screen. Song, bad. Artist, U2. Album, The Unforgettable Fire. Length, 608. Doyle's voice cut through the room. It's the number of repeats. What do you mean? Grace asked. Doyle shook his head, disbelief clear in his tone. There's no way it's right. It says it's played on a loop over 3 million times. Eva nodded. I already did the math. That's about 40 years. The weight of the statement hung in the air, leaving them all speechless. Their thoughts were interrupted by an excited outburst from Anika. That's it! She exclaimed. You got in? Eva shifted to face her. They all moved behind Anika, peering over her shoulder at the screen. Anika began to explain, her voice filled with a mix of excitement and seriousness. The first thing we found after the power came back online was that the drives were empty. But that didn't make any sense, because you had 20 people living on here for the 6-month journey. Anika's fingers moved swiftly over the keyboard. Someone definitely wiped every single drive, and there's no way to recall deleted files. But then I started thinking, digital files don't ever really go away until something overwrites them. And sure enough, there's a huge partitioned area on the drive that is full of data. I just had no way to access it. She indicated an area on the screen full of technical info, her cursor hovering over it. So, you got in? Grace asked. Yes. Marcus was able to remove the partition. We have access to the data. Anika moved the cursor over the files and directories displayed on the screen. This is the last file that was created from the bridge. It looks like it's an audio log entry. With a click, she opened the file, and the speakers crackled to life. A wave of static filled the room. Muffled voices struggled to break through the white noise, their words indistinct and haunting. The sound of a microphone being adjusted created a jarring noise, followed by the sound of heavy breathing. A wavering voice began to speak.
I don't understand what's happening. Our systems are failing. 1 minute it's freezing. The next it's like an oven. We've checked everything, but nothing explains it. We're seeing things. Hallucinations. Maybe. Crews reporting shadows. Figures in the corridor. But they're not there when you look straight at them. It's like we're losing our minds. Communications are dead. We can't reach Earth. It's like we've been cut off from everything. Everyone. The isolation it's unbearable. We're out here, all alone, and something is very wrong. Alarms keep going off. False alarms, but they feel real. We're running on no sleep, constantly on edge. There's this constant sense of dread, like we're being watched, but there's nobody there. Nobody can sleep properly. Lights keep flickering. There's this noise, or is it voices? It's hard to tell anymore. Everything's blurred. We're so tired. Too tired to think clearly. We're lost. Navigation's a mess. The stars they're all wrong. We've been trying to recalibrate, but nothing's working. We're just drifting aimlessly. The ship, it's crawling with something. It's not mold, not corrosion. It's like it's eating the ship. Air's getting heavy, hard to breathe. This isn't right. I can't explain any of this. It's like a nightmare we can't wake up from. Everything's going wrong, and we don't know why. If anyone finds this, no, we thought we were prepared for anything Bentham. It's not just empty. It's alive. It's against us. Everything is against us. The bulkheads, they're not right. Can't trust the air. Can't trust the lights. The ship, it's alive. It's turning against us. I can hear it. Whispering. No, it's laughing at us, mocking us. We have to leave. It's the only way. The habitat. It's calling to us. A refuge. Has to be better than this. This hell. We'll take the Rangers. Ranger 1 and 2. Our only home. But the stars, they're singing a lullaby. Or is it a requiem? Can't sleep. No sleep till we're safe. Till we're home. But where is home? The habitat. Yes, our new home. And the clocks are melting, dripping like rain. Singing clocks, in the rain, dancing. We're all dancing to the tune of time. Time is dancing too.
A heavy silence enveloped the bridge of Frontier 1, the crew momentarily speechless in the wake of the audio log's static-filled message. The eerie sounds they had just heard hung in the air, adding to the already thick atmosphere of mystery and strangeness aboard the ship. "Well, thanks for that bedtime story from hell," Doyle said. "I won't sleep for weeks." Grace turned to Anika. "Can you bring the whole drive with us?" she asked. "No," Anika said. "It's hardwired into the ship." "Then what about the comms connection between the ships?" Nolan, his gaze shifting across the room, noted the power console's readings. "The reserve batteries are already down to 59%. It was 63 when I turned it on." Anika pressed an eject button on her console, and a square plastic object slid out. "This external disk has limited space, but I've downloaded the most recent files." "Good," Grace said. "Let's take it back to Frontier 2 and show it to the commander." After a moment of contemplation, she added, "And Marcus, can you power down the ship from here so we can preserve those batteries?" Marcus nodded and began to tap keys on one of the control consoles. The crew watched in silence as he executed the command sequence to power down the ship. As the lights on the bridge flickered and then went out, plunging them back into semi-darkness, Nolan's eyes swept over the crew's faces. He noted the combined look of confusion and concern clear in each of their expressions. Chapter 14. 14 hours after the crash of Ranger 4, Nolan watched as Doyle flipped the power switch of the emergency radio. The device hummed to life. A red light glowed on the front, signaling its readiness, while the LCD screen flickered on, displaying basic functions in a soft green light. Doyle unfolded the retractable antenna and pulled it to its full length, about a foot long, ensuring maximum signal reach. He then turned a large, recessed dial, gradually increasing the volume. The sound of static grew louder, a hissing backdrop that filled the tense air around them. Doyle kneeled in the sand, positioning the bright yellow and black radio before him. Grace and Eva, drawn by the thin thread of hope the radio represented, gathered close. Nearby, Anika lay unconscious, the gravity of her condition unchanged. "Here goes nothing," Doyle muttered. He picked up the microphone, pressing the button on its side. Frontier 2, Frontier 2. This is the unofficial warden of Desolation Station," Doyle said. "We're having a great time down here wrestling monster sea creatures and drinking cocktails with a side of existential dread. Are you there?" A heavy silence followed his call. The group waited, but the radio offered only static in response. Doyle keyed the mic again, his voice projecting a false cheer. "As much as we love our scenic spot next to the sea of impending doom, we're just about ready for you to come and pick us up." Yet again, they heard only static. "What's wrong?" Doyle said. His frustration was apparent as he looked up at Nolan. "I thought you said this stronger radio would get through the walls of the habitat." Grace, despite the obvious pain in her leg, kneeled beside Doyle, her eyes narrowing as she studied the radio's display. "Look here," she said, pointing to the LCD screen. "This little symbol here should light up if the radio's connected with another station." "Well then, why is it not connecting?" Doyle said. Nolan cast his gaze around, taking in the landscape that curved above them. "I still think the outer walls are too thick," he said, thinking. "And we're right next to the outside, the thickest part." He motioned towards the sloping terrain surrounding them. "It's like we're on the inside of a massive tube. If we could get the radio signal out the end of this tube, I think we can make that connection with Frontier 2. Grace looked at Nolan, skepticism and curiosity mingling in her expression. "So, what are you proposing?" Nolan gestured upwards. "Well, if we could get the radio to the very center of the tube and shoot the signal out the ends, I think that would be our best shot." His finger traced the length of the long, narrow shaft that ran down the center of the habitat, like an axle through its core. Doyle snorted. "Great idea, Einstein," he said. "And how exactly do you propose we do that?" Doyle's sarcasm didn't deter Nolan. "What we're feeling is artificial gravity. Remember how the whole cylinder is spinning? That creates the illusion of gravity through centripetal force." "Lucky us," Doyle said. "I didn't know we were going to get a free science lesson." Nolan continued. "Towards the center of the tube, the artificial gravity decreases. So if we could get the radio up there, it should just float in the center without falling back down." Grace, now engaged in the conversation, added, "Is that why I couldn't control the Ranger right before we crashed?" "Exactly," Nolan nodded. Doyle's expression revealed his skepticism. "Yeah, but how do we get it up there? It's got to be thousands of feet." "I'm guessing about 3 miles, Nolan said, recalling an analysis he had seen on Frontier 2. The habitat has a 6-mile diameter. Doyle threw his hands up in exasperation. "Well, great idea, Professor. I'll just go get my jetpack and fly it up there." "Actually," Nolan said, "I thought about using the EVA suit. It has external thrusters and would probably operate pretty well towards the center of the habitat. But I have a better idea. We make a hot air balloon. Doyle shook his head, disbelief written all over his face. Because somehow that's less crazy than a jetpack. Nolan's eyes sparkled with enthusiasm. We can use the foil blankets to make a lightweight balloon, add the right kind of heat, and tie it to the radio. Then voila, it should rise right into place. Grace's expression shifted to one of contemplation. But if the radio's up there, how will we be able to use it? Nolan locked eyes with her. Back in the war, how did you stay in contact with the aircraft carrier when you didn't have line-of-sight communications? A light of realization sparked in Grace's eyes. A repeater, she exclaimed, her hands coming together in a sudden clap. You're going to turn the emergency radio into a repeater. Doyle sighed. Can someone explain this to those of us who don't have a ham radio license? Grace, now visibly excited, turned to Doyle. The emergency radio will go up there. She pointed upwards, towards the center of the habitat's tube. But the walkie-talkie will be down here with us. Nolan will connect them like a chain. He can send a signal from the handheld, it'll beam up to the balloon radio, and that will transmit it right out the side of the habitat tube into space. A sharp, sudden gasp came from Anika's direction. They all turned to see Anika's body jerking violently, her arms and legs flailing in uncontrollable spasms. Ava sprang into action. She's having a hypoxia seizure, she shouted as she rushed towards Anika. Eva kneeled beside her, assessing the situation. She rolled Anika onto her side, and she cleared all objects around Anika that could cause injury during the convulsions. Keep her head steady, but don't restrain her movements, Eva instructed, glancing over her shoulder at the others and placing a folded jacket under Anika's head. After what felt like an eternity, Anika's convulsions subsided. Her body relaxed, though she remained unconscious. Eva checked Anika's pulse and then looked up at the anxious faces surrounding her. She needs more than what I can give her here, Eva said. We need to get her off this beach and into a proper medical facility immediately. This hypoxia is a bad sign. As the gravity of the situation settled over the group, Eva's attention turned back to Nolan. How long until you can get the balloon deployed? Chapter 15. As the light within the habitat dimmed, Nolan spread the first emergency blanket on the sand, its metallic surface glinting. He paused, looking up at the changing light. Is it just me, or is it getting darker? He asked, his voice carrying over the sound of the waves. Grace looked up from her attempts to program the radio. I think you're right. Can we launch the balloon in the dark? Nolan thought as he tore open the second emergency blanket. Technically, yes, he replied while unfolding the shiny material. We don't need the light to launch it, but I'd feel better with full visibility. The blankets, now fully spread out, were surprisingly large. In the waning light, the thin metallic material shimmered, ethereal, threatening to lift in the gentle breeze off the sea. Nolan worked, his movements precise and deliberate. As Grace and Doyle finished their discussion on the radio's settings, they joined Nolan. Their shadows loomed over his makeshift workspace. They watched, a mix of curiosity and apprehension in their eyes, as Nolan began the meticulous process of joining the blankets. Nolan used the tape from the survival kit, overlapping the edges of the foil material. He started folding them, creating a tapered shape at the top and bottom, resembling the beginnings of a hot air balloon. He focused on each fold and crease. You never told us you were a genuine origami expert, Doyle said in a voice of mock admiration. Unfazed, Nolan continued, pressing the tape along the lengths of the creases, joining the shimmering pieces into one cohesive structure. I know what you said, Nolan, Grace said in the silence, her gaze drifting down the beach where Anika lay. But I think we need to send the radio up now. Nolan, absorbed in his task, responded without looking up. There are too many things that could go wrong. Doyle, standing a few feet away, chimed in. Sounds like it's 2 votes to your 1, boss. Grace is right. Anika can't afford for us to wait. Nolan shook his head, pausing, and looked up at Doyle. It's better to wait and make sure it's done right in the morning. He continued measuring the parachute cord for the rigging. Why don't you go ask Eva if Anika can wait? Sure, Doyle said, already moving towards Eva. I'll bet Anika's dying to weigh in too. Oh wait, no, she's just plain dying. Nolan sighed, a mix of frustration and concern etching his face, then turned his attention to the final piece of the puzzle, the heat source. He had 2 emergency flares left. Each one was bright and hot enough for his purpose. He attached the radio and one of the flares to a small platform he'd fashioned from the wreckage, making sure it was secure and centered under the balloon's open base. Nolan stood back, scrutinizing the silvery contraption, searching for any potential faults. Grace rejoined him, her presence a silent support. As he looked up, he noticed the light inside the habitat had transformed into a tapestry of vibrant colors, reminiscent of a beautiful sunset, despite the absence of a sun or sky. Eva wants us to launch right away, Grace said. Her voice was soft, understanding. I still think it's a mistake, Nolan said, resigned. But if that's the consensus, then it's ready to go. 10 minutes later, they gathered in a circle around the balloon. Nolan held its top, the flare mounted below the balloon's opening. Full darkness had enveloped the habitat's interior, the gentle sea breeze the only sound in the quiet night. Anika lay nearby, her condition unchanged, with Eva casting worried glances in her direction. Here we go, Nolan said, determination lining his voice. He glanced at Grace. Does the walkie-talkie have a connection to the emergency radio? Yes, she said, her eyes on the small screen. It says the repeater function is online and ready. With a swift motion, Nolan struck the end of the flare with the cap. It ignited, casting a bright, fiery glow across the beach. He positioned the top of the flare upward, directing the intense heat into the hole at the base of the improvised balloon. The group formed a tight circle around the launch zone, their faces illuminated by the flare's glow. Though the heat was rising into the balloon, very little seemed to happen. Doyle couldn't help but comment. Gotta say this is riveting, boss. Are you sure this is gonna work? Give it a minute, Nolan replied. Despite his outward confidence, he felt a nagging doubt, but he pushed it aside. The plan had to work. At first, the balloon filled slowly, the emergency blankets billowing. The metallic material, reflecting the flare's light, shimmered as it expanded. Then, as more heat filled its interior, the structure began to round out, taking on the full shape of a hot air balloon. The once flat sheets now formed a large orb, shimmering in the night. A collective gasp escaped the group as the balloon lifted off the ground. It rose hesitant at first, barely clearing the sand, then gained momentum. It floated up, rising above their heads, the light from the flare casting long, dancing shadows on the beach. Grace, caught up in the moment, clapped, her face alight. The balloon continued its ascent, climbing higher into the dark expanse of the habitat. The glow from the flare, now several feet above them, served as a beacon in the darkness, marking the balloon's progress. As the balloon ascended, a sudden whipping breeze, born from the waves, swept across the beach. The group watched in dismay as the wind caught the balloon. The contraption, still not high enough to be clear of the trees, was now being carried sideways by the wind's forceful embrace. Its trajectory shifted, moving more horizontally than vertically, being swept towards the dense jungle. Their faces, previously lit by the flare's hopeful glow, now fell into shadow as the balloon drifted away. Then, with a suddenness that felt like a physical blow, the balloon snagged in a tree deep within the forest, its light extinguishing as it tangled in the dense foliage, disappearing from sight. The feeling of defeat hung heavy in the air, a crushing weight that settled over the group. They had been so close. Doyle let out a string of curses, his frustration echoing in the still night air, while Eva dropped her face in her hands. Nolan turned to Grace. "Do you still have a connection with the repeater?" he asked. "Yes, but the radio didn't get enough altitude to work yet." "Then we need to get it back." You're not really going out there into the jungle at night? Eva asked. Nolan glanced towards Doyle. I don't think that's a good idea. Why are you looking at me, champ? Doyle said. I stand by my vote. Anika isn't magically going to get better. Okay then, Nolan said. We'll head out to find it at first light. Chapter 16. Less than an hour before the crash of Ranger 4. Nolan settled back into the co-pilot seat aboard Ranger 4 as Grace began the procedures to undock from Frontier 1. With practiced motions, she initiated the sequence. The airlock is sealed and system checks are complete, Grace said. We're ready to disengage. Nolan glanced out the front windscreen, his gaze drifting past the dark, silent bulk of Frontier 1. The Bentham anomaly, with its dual rotating structures, loomed in the distance, casting a foreboding shadow in space. He couldn't help but wonder about the fate of Frontier 1's crew. Had they really evacuated to those enigmatic cylinders? A gentle bump signaled their departure, followed by the subtle hum of Ranger 4's thrusters, nudging them away. Grace's hands moved over the control panel, adjusting their trajectory, the soft glow of the displays illuminating her focused expression. Grace broke the silence, speaking into the comms headset. Frontier 2, this is Ranger 4. Our apologies for the delayed check-in, but we are ready to return. She paused. Definitely ready to return. Nolan watched as Grace's fingers danced across the flight control panel, inputting their flight trajectory. After a prolonged silence, she stopped mid-action and looked at Nolan. Frontier 2, this is Ranger 4. Do you copy? Grace repeated. Only silence answered her call. Grace's hands moved to check the radio, her fingers adjusting knobs. She then returned her attention to the flight controls, a crease of worry forming between her eyes. Nolan, can you check the radios while I monitor our course? I'm on it. Nolan leaned forward, scrutinizing the radio's settings, flipping switches. He examined the communications gear. Power settings, frequency alignment, antenna alignment, all optimal as far as he could tell. From the crew cabin, Anika Patel's voice cut through the tension. What's going on up there? Is everything okay? Nolan glanced over his shoulder, calling back. No response from Frontier 2. As Ranger 4 swung around, aligning itself for the return trajectory, Frontier 2 drifted into view through the wide windscreen. Nolan narrowed his eyes. Maybe it was just his imagination playing tricks, but the ship seemed to lack its usual vitality, its internal lights somehow dimmer. Anika sensed an opportunity to help, floating up behind Nolan's seat, her face set with determination. Switch places with me, she said. Let me see if I can remotely tap into their systems. Sure thing, Nolan agreed, unclipping his harness and floating out of the co-pilot seat. Anika maneuvered into his place. How long until we dock? Nolan asked Grace. We're about 10 minutes out. Nolan floated back into the crew compartment as Anika settled. She donned her own headset, her fingers moving to interface with Frontier 2's systems. Nolan sank into the vacant seat beside Doyle, who flashed his usual roguish grin. Welcome to the cheap seats, Doyle said, a glint of unease behind his casual bravado. Enjoying the downgrade to economy class? Nolan ignored the barb, his gaze fixed out the front windscreen, where Frontier 2 loomed larger with each passing moment. This is strange, Anika muttered half to herself. My connection is solid, but there's no response on any hailing frequency. What does that mean? Nolan asked. I'm not sure. Someone is supposed to man the station at all times. After a brief pause, Anika added, Grace, can you dock without making contact? It's against protocol, but technically, yes. Nolan watched Anika's hands move, navigating through a menu within the comm system that was unfamiliar to him. There, she announced. I've tapped into their internal intercom system. I can connect directly to any module on board. Try the engineering bay, Grace suggested. As Anika initiated the call, Nolan found himself distracted and looked outside. Through the window, he saw a bizarre spectacle unfolding on Frontier 2. The lights within the spacecraft's compartments flickered and extinguished one by one. Then, something even more unsettling occurred. Some kind of dark wave rippled across the outside of the hull, moving from the base to the top of the ship, like a shadow swallowing the light. "Grace," Nolan exclaimed. "Did you see that?" "See what?" "The lights. The hull. Something strange is happening over there." But his words trailed off as Anika held up a hand for silence, her headset pressed tight to her ear. "I've got something here," she said. She unplugged her headset jack. A burst of static poured from the Ranger's comm speakers, followed by a confused, frightened voice. "Hello? Who's there?" The voice shook with barely contained panic. In the background, emergency klaxons wailed. "This is Ranger 4, Anika said. "Who are we speaking with?" "Ranger 4, came the shocked reply. "You aren't on the ship?" "No. We are returning from Frontier 1. We need someone to acknowledge our return per docking procedures. We have been unable to reach the bridge." "Stop," the voice interrupted, urgent and commanding now. "Do not approach. Divert immediately." The Ranger crew exchanged bewildered looks across the narrow cabin space. "Please clarify Frontier 2, Anika said. "Is the ship in trouble?" "There are sounds, no, whispers." The voice fractured, dissolving into murmurs too low to decipher. In the background, the klaxon still shrieked. Nolan felt a chill race down his spine as he noted the lights on Frontier 2 dimming in irregular waves, darkness devouring the distant ship section by section. The panicked voice returned, fainter but more frantic than before. "The lights, flickering. And the black rain. It's on the walls. Running over everything." Abruptly, the audio dissolved into white noise as the channel closed. "You sure you didn't accidentally call into the ship's psych ward?" Doyle said. Eva, her face a mask of concern, chimed in. "That sounded way too much like the captain's log from Frontier 1. Marcus spoke up. "Grace, are we sure we want to go back there?" "What choice do we have?" "Maybe back off. Wait. Evaluate." Grace looked around, searching for a consensus. Finding none, she made a decision. She tapped a button and pulled back on the controls. The reverse thrusters engaged, and the forward motion of Ranger 4 slowed. "We can't drift out here indefinitely," Grace said, almost to herself, thinking aloud. "We'll need to." Before she could finish, total darkness consumed Ranger 4, all systems shutting down. In the silence that followed, the creaks and ticks of the cooling spacecraft sounded all around them. With a sinking feeling, Nolan realized it wasn't just the lights. The spacecraft was as silent as a tomb. All systems were offline. Ranger 4 was adrift. "Nothing's responding," Grace said, her voice laced with panic. In the pitch-black cabin, Nolan could hear Marcus fumbling with a computer panel. "It's a complete loss of power," Marcus reported, his voice loud in the darkness. "All systems are unresponsive, not just offline. It's like everything just turned off." "Just wonderful," Doyle said. "So what does that mean for us?" "It means we're dead in the water," Grace said. "Unless the ship comes back online, we're stuck here until Frontier 2 sends someone to get us." Nolan gazed out at Frontier 2's lifeless hulk, trying to tamp down his rising panic. "Why do I get the feeling they're not coming to get us anytime soon?" Chapter 17. 26 hours after the crash of Ranger 4. Nolan craned his neck upward, his gaze lost in the jungle canopy that stretched high above. "You've got to be kidding me," Doyle said, hands on his hips as he took in the towering behemoth. They had been trekking through the dense jungle for hours, relying on a mix of memory and Grace's signal tracking to locate the runaway communications balloon they had sent up after the crash. The further they moved into the forest, the more the habitat's unique reverse-sloping terrain had disappeared from view, obscured by the closely growing trees. It was as if they had been transported from an advanced space station into the heart of the Amazon. Now they stood at the base of the largest tree any of them had ever laid eyes on. Its trunk, wider than a small house, and its crown lost from sight high above the jungle canopy. Somewhere up there, Nolan's makeshift balloon was caught in the upper branches. "Are you sure this is it?" Nolan asked Grace, gazing up into the puzzle of interwoven branches and leaves, searching for any sign of the balloon. "Yeah, the signal strength is maxed out," Grace replied, consulting the device. "This has got to be the place." Nolan paced the perimeter of the colossal tree, craning his neck for any glimpse of the balloon. Finally, he spotted something. A faint shimmer of sunlight glancing off the metallic contraption nestled high in the branches. "There it is," he called out, pointing up through a gap in the leaves. The other two gathered around, following the line of his gesture. Doyle let out an exaggerated groan. "You didn't say anything about having to climb a freaking redwood to get this thing back. How am I supposed to get all the way up there?" Nolan smiled, unable to resist ribbing him. "One branch at a time, my friend." Doyle muttered a curse under his breath as he stepped up to the tree and began scanning the surface for potential handholds and footholds to begin his ascent. His eyes assessed each branch and handhold, calculating his route. Nolan picked up the makeshift backpack he had fashioned from a section of the parachute and handed it over to Doyle. "Don't forget this." Doyle took the pack and slung it over one shoulder without looking back. Nolan laced his fingers together and crouched down, presenting his hands as a foothold. "Here," Nolan said. "Let me give you a boost." Doyle turned and regarded Nolan with a look somewhere between a scowl and thinly veiled disdain at the offer. He put his left boot into Nolan's hands and grabbed a sturdy branch overhead. "On three," Nolan said, straining against Doyle's weight as the man prepared to hoist himself up. "1, 2, 3. With a burst of effort accompanied by loud grunting, Doyle pulled himself up onto the first bough, scrambling for secure handholds on smaller branches. Satisfied his crewmate was on his way, Nolan settled with his back against a neighboring tree to wait it out. Grace limped over and sat alongside him. "You're enjoying this a little too much," she said with a wry smile. "Maybe," Nolan chuckled. Companionable silence hung between them for a few moments, interrupted only by the sounds of Doyle ascending steadily into the heights of the unusual tree. "For what it's worth, I also voted to launch that balloon at night," Grace added. "Yeah, but you're not as much of a pain as he is." Their conversation lapsed once more. Somewhere far overhead, they heard Doyle remarking on the stunning vista revealed from his rising vantage point, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Nolan called back an encouraging assurance about being halfway there as Grace pulled a small pill bottle out of her pocket. She twisted the cap off the container and tapped 3 capsules into her palm, tossed them into her mouth, and dry swallowed. "Did Eva give you those for the eel bite?" "Not exactly." Grace's smile was guilty. "I may have just snuck them from the medical kit without asking." "Is it helping with the infection?" "It's helping the pain." Changing the subject, Grace asked, "Did you notice when daylight started up this morning?" Nolan thought back to when the daylight had begun to shine. "I'm guessing it kicked about 24 hours after the last sunrise. Why do you ask?" Grace tapped a finger against her watch. "What are the odds this place would have a perfectly Earth-like 24-hour day-night cycle, and that the artificial gravity feels exactly like 1G? Nolan turned her observation over in his mind, struck by how eerie and familiar their bizarre surroundings felt in some ways. Before he could respond, Doyle's voice rang out once more from his distant, unseen perch. "You're missing one hell of a view up here." His sarcastic but good-natured tone echoed down through the trees. "I can see, more trees. And would you look at that? Even more dang trees. Picturesque stuff, I tell ya." "Keep up the good work," Nolan shouted back with an amused shake of his head. He returned his gaze to Grace. "That was some weird stuff that happened before the crash," she said. Nolan laughed. "Which weird stuff?" The crew quarters on Frontier 1? Their commander's final log? Or whatever happened to us in Ranger 4? All of it, she said. After a moment of thought, she asked, "What was the first strange thing that happened?" Nolan thought about it, his brow furrowing. "Well," Commander Reynolds admitted that we'd lost contact with Earth at some point. Grace nodded, her eyes distant. "Wait," Nolan said, a sudden realization dawning. "You know, now that I think about it, the first odd thing I noticed was back on Frontier 2. When I was prepping my gear after getting out of suspended animation, I realized my harmonica was missing." "Harmonica?" "Yeah, back on Earth I play music every day, piano mainly, some guitar, but I can't exactly bring those instruments up here with us, so I settled for my harmonica." "And it wasn't in there? What's so strange about that? Maybe you forgot to pack it." Doyle's voice echoed down from high above. "Woo, boy. It sure is purty up here." Nolan glanced up, squinting against the dappled sunlight filtering through the leaves. Doyle was now a mere speck, almost swallowed by the lush greenery of the canopy. Among the branches, his agile and determined figure was barely discernible. "Any luck?" Grace called up, her hands cupped around her mouth to amplify her voice. "You bet your sweet self." Doyle's voice floated down, filled with satisfaction. There was the sound of branches rustling and some struggle. "I got it. It all looks intact. And there's a bonus," he called down, his voice growing stronger as he began his descent. "What's that?" Nolan said, watching as Doyle started making his way down, moving with a swiftness that belied his earlier complaints. The descent was clearly easier, gravity aiding his journey back down. "There's a clearing!" Doyle shouted, now more audible as he neared them. "It's not far off, and it'll be perfect for us to launch this baby again." He watched as Doyle deftly navigated the last few branches, his descent a controlled tumble through the green maze. "Nice work," Grace said, standing and brushing off her pants. Doyle finally reached the ground with a soft thud, a triumphant grin on his face. He unslung the pack, carefully extracting the communications balloon. Despite its journey, it looked surprisingly unscathed. "Let's head to this clearing of yours," Nolan said. "Lead the way." Chapter 18. Less than 30 minutes later, Nolan, Doyle, and Grace found themselves in a large clearing in the jungle's heart. The surrounding space opened up, revealing a stunning vista within the confines of the habitat. Nolan examined the makeshift balloon, ensuring every part was intact and ready for its crucial journey. Doyle, arms crossed, watched with a skeptical eye. "How do you know it won't just get stuck in the trees again?" he asked. Nolan looked around, gesturing to their surroundings. They stood amid an expansive clearing, where the break in the dense tree line revealed the awe-inspiring nature of the cylindrical world. The terrain sloped upwards in a gradual curve, wrapping around the inside of the tube-shaped landscape. It was a breathtaking sight that seemed to defy physics. The far side of the tube, miles away, arched above them, a distant ceiling of greenery and earth. "Remember," Nolan said, "our goal is to wait until the balloon is all the way up there, in the middle of the tube. Then, we'll use the radio strapped to it as a repeater to redirect our radio signal out the end of the habitat." "How long will we have?" Grace asked, her gaze following the proposed flight path. "Once it gets up to the center, it will be in zero gravity. It should just float there." Nolan gazed upwards, studying the end of the tube closest to them, thinking of it as a cap. Unlike the inner landscape where they stood, the caps didn't have terrain or plant life. They appeared to be made of metal, with 12 linear supports radiating out from the center, resembling the lines on a clock. The cap at the far end of the habitat was glowing with light, akin to sunshine. Nolan pondered whether this illumination was reflected from outside the habitat or artificially created. His eyes roamed the length of the structure, taking in the majestic scale of their surroundings. As his gaze swept across the vast interior, it settled on the crumbling remains of the city, far off in the distance. Skyscrapers stretched towards the center of the tube, dwarfed by the sheer size of the habitat. Many were partially collapsed, their broken silhouettes obscured by the distance and the slight haze of the atmosphere, looming like ghosts of a forgotten era. Nolan snapped back to the task at hand, placing the final remaining flare into position. He looked over at Grace, seeking confirmation that she was ready. She nodded, her expression focused and determined. Nolan struck the cap against the flare, igniting it with a sharp hiss. Even in the broad daylight, the flare glowed brightly. He angled the flame toward the balloon's opening, watching as the heat filled the silver foil structure. The balloon expanded, its sides stretching and pulling taut. Slowly, it lifted off the ground, ascending into the air. Unlike their previous attempt on the beach, there was no breeze here in the clearing to carry it off course. The balloon rose upwards. "It's working," Nolan said. "How's the repeater connection?" Grace tore her gaze from the ascending balloon, looking at the screen of the walkie-talkie in her hand. "The connection is solid. How will I know when we're ready to transmit?" "Give it a bit more time. We want the balloon to be as close to the center of the tube as possible." As they watched, the balloon climbed higher and higher, now just a speck against the vast backdrop of the habitat's interior. Its foil surface caught the light, glinting, while the flare continued to burn with a steady glow. "Let's try now," Nolan suggested after a moment. He watched as Grace checked the frequency on the walkie-talkie screen one last time. "Frontier 2, this is Grace Harper calling from within the habitat. Do you read us?" Silence followed, the trio waiting in anticipation. She tried again. "Frontier 2, our Ranger crash-landed and we need extraction. Are you receiving our signal?" Time stretched, each second heavy with expectation. Then, a faint crackle broke the silence. Something echoed on the other end of the radio. Grace's eyes widened as she pointed at the small screen of the walkie-talkie. A small symbol had lit up, showing a powerful signal. "There's a connection," she said, her voice a mix of hope and disbelief. "Then why is no one talking?" Doyle said. Grace lifted the radio, about to speak again, but before she could, a voice crackled through the static, breaking the tension. "This is Commander Jake Reynolds of Frontier 2. I'm recording this message as a last resort. Most of the crew are compromised. We have been forced to initiate emergency evacuation protocols and place the ship into a low-power mode. I don't know how to describe it. It was an unexplainable event. Some kind of unknown force has taken control of the spacecraft. We're not equipped to deal with this. Whatever it is, I fear we've gravely miscalculated the risks. I'm instituting the code Black Horizon. I haven't made the decision lightly, but I don't dare leave all systems operational. Please come to the habitat. Please come get us. We need help, and I'm afraid that we don't have much time. Magnus, if you are the one to get this message, you warned me. And heavens, you were right. I didn't believe you. We thought we were prepared, but nothing could have prepared us for this. I pray the crew doesn't pay the price for my arrogance. I pray you get this message, please. Come find us in the habitat before it's too late. And don't make the same mistakes we did. Reynolds out." Nolan let out a breath he didn't even realize he'd been holding. He turned to Grace, her eyes wide, reflecting the shock that had settled over both her and Doyle. There was a crackle from the radio, and the voice began speaking again. "This is Commander Jake Reynolds of Frontier 2. I'm recording this message as a last resort." "It's repeating," Grace said, her voice a whisper. "Turn it off," Nolan said as the strained message continued droning in the background. "I don't want to hear it again." Nolan saw that Grace was frozen, shock etched on her face. He reached out and took the radio from her hand. As he moved to turn it off, another symbol on the screen caught his eye. "What's this?" he asked. "That's strange," Grace murmured, leaning in closer. "That means there's another signal." Nolan examined the radio and pressed a button marked Scan. Commander Reynolds' voice cut off mid-sentence as the radio buzzed and whirred. The numbers on the small LCD screen blurred by. Then it stopped. A piercing, warbling whine filled the speakers. Nolan turned down the volume. "What is that?" he asked. Grace snatched the radio back, her eyes scanning the screen. It's a distress signal. It's an automated tone that comes from the Frontier escape pods. After a moment's study, she continued. The signal is too strong to be outside the habitat. It's coming from inside somewhere. And it's getting stronger. Stronger? Doyle asked. Does that mean it's getting closer to us? No, Nolan said, his gaze lifting to the distance. The makeshift balloon was still visible, now drifting down the center of the habitat, moving away from them. It means that the balloon is getting closer to whatever is sending the signal. All three watched as the balloon, its foil surface reflecting the artificial sunlight and the bright flare burning, floated towards the edge of the crumbling city, far in the distance. Nolan looked down at the walkie-talkie screen, noting that the signal connection was maxed out. That's where it's coming from, Nolan said. The escape pod that's sending the signal. It must be somewhere at the edge of that city. The three exchanged looks, each considering their options in the silence that followed. Well, looks to me like adventure is calling, Doyle said. I say, let's go. Best case, we're saved. Worst case, we find more people to share in our suffering. Chapter 19. Moments before the crash of Ranger 4. The interior of the Ranger 4 shuttle was dark, the subtle creaks and groans of the lifeless hull audible in the heavy silence. An occasional faint pop or hiss pierced the quiet as the metal contracted in the cold. Nolan, still sitting in the crew compartment, gazed out at Frontier 2. It was close enough he could make out the details of its structure, but might as well have been 1,000,000 miles away. They were adrift, alone. Is it just me? Eva spoke into the quiet. Or is it getting colder in here? With all systems offline, there's nothing regulating cabin temperature, Marcus replied from the engineer's station. We've got the air we brought in with us, but no way to warm it. Life support is dead. A moment later, Grace spoke up from the pilot's seat. Hey, do you guys see this? There's something weird on my window here. Nolan peered over to look. At the edges of Grace's window, a strange, powdery black substance was creeping in along the edges. It looked almost crystalline as it branched inward. He glanced at his own window and saw tendrils of the black material advancing there as well. Is it some kind of ice formation? He wondered aloud. But space was a vacuum. There shouldn't be moisture condensing on the hull to create ice crystals. This was something else entirely. Before anyone could speculate further, a sudden grinding screech reverberated through Ranger 4's hull. The crew spun toward the source as the hideous shriek intensified. What in heaven's name is that? Doyle said. The abrasive screech continued, seeming to come from every direction at once. It felt almost as if something gigantic and rough was raking itself across Ranger 4's exterior. Then another sound joined the cacophony, a deep, oscillating vibration humming through the hull. Growing stronger by the second, the strange harmonic became an overpowering, all-encompassing sensation. Nolan gripped his seat as he watched the dark, crystalline material conquer the rest of the window area, blacking out their only view to the outside within seconds. At the same moment, the interior lights went out, casting them into absolute darkness. We've got to do something, Grace said. A moment later, a thin beam pierced the blackness as Marcus switched on a flashlight. In the pale glow, Nolan could make out the tense faces of the crew, wide eyes reflecting simmering fear. At least these still work, he muttered, the light dancing off his grim expression. Without warning, a heavy thump shook the Ranger. The ship jerked, a rough, jarring motion that tossed the crew about. The spacecraft was moving now, not by their own volition but by some external, unseen force. Nolan gripped his seat as the sensation of movement overwhelmed him. It felt as though they were being pulled into the belly of a vast, unknown creature. The movements were dizzying, disorienting, a wild dance in the clutches of something unfathomable. He couldn't say why, but every fiber of his being screamed that this was wrong. In an instant, reality aboard Ranger 4 shifted into a realm of unimaginable chaos. The dark, ominous substance that had obscured their windows retreated more suddenly than it had appeared. revealing a scene so surreal it defied belief. Nolan saw something impossible flash across the window. A nightscape, clouds, trees, impressions of a planet's surface careening past. Below them, an immense ground loomed, rushing up to meet them with terrifying speed. "What is happening?" Grace cried out. "Where are we?" Nolan's hands clenched the arms of his chair, his knuckles white with strain. "What the heck is this?" Grace's voice was full of panic and disbelief. From his engineer's station, Marcus called out over the escalating noise. "I've gotten basic power restored, but propulsion is still offline." "Nolan, get up here," Grace called from the pilot's seat. "I need you." Unbuckling his harness, Nolan stumbled towards the cockpit, trying to switch places with Anika. His movements were heavy, weighted. "I feel gravity," he said. "What's happening?" Grace worked to halt Ranger 4's uncontrolled tumbling, her focus showing the first cracks of panic. "Come on, damn you," she spat through gritted teeth, wrenching back on the unresponsive controls. "It won't start," she cried out. From the crew compartment, Marcus called out to Grace, "I'm trying to reboot." "Try faster." As Nolan settled into his seat beside Grace, he could only watch in horror as the ground hurtled towards them. Nolan focused on the controls. The air pressure within Ranger 4 fluctuated, tossing the spacecraft as if it were only a child's toy. The altimeter, once reliable, now spun, its readings a jumbled mess of numbers that offered no hint of truth. "This is a nightmare," Grace muttered, her voice strained as she fought with the controls. The flight instruments before her were in complete disarray, the navigation systems spewing out skewed data, leaving them flying blind. Marcus whooped as Ranger 4's dormant systems roared to life. Interior lights flashed on and panels blinked awake, giving them hope. A sudden, jarring boom reverberated through the Ranger, followed by a desperate whining sound as the engines struggled to engage. "I can't get control," Grace grunted, her body straining against the controls as the ship spun, the G-forces mounting to almost untenable levels. The very structure of the Ranger seemed to protest, creaking, groaning under the stress of forces it was never designed to withstand. "The flight systems aren't right," Grace yelled, her voice nearly lost amidst the cacophony. Nolan, assisting at the controls, felt a dizzying disorientation. Outside, there were no stars, no horizon, nothing to anchor their senses in this strange, terrifying place. The ship shook, each tremor a brutal assault. The force of their descent threw them against their harnesses, tossing them from side to side. "We need to eject," Nolan said to Grace. "We can't. Not unless I can stop the spinning." "We have no time. I'm doing the best I can." Nolan turned towards the crew cabin. "Brace for ejection." "Not yet." Panic tinged Anika's voice. "I'm not buckled." "Hurry," Nolan urged, his heart racing. "The ground is too close," Grace yelled. "Okay, now go, eject." Nolan glanced back, seeing Anika struggling with her harness, the force of the descent hindering her efforts. He unfastened his own harness, thinking he could assist her. "Gotta go now," Grace called. She slammed her hand down on the ejection button, but nothing happened. The ground was racing towards them, seconds remaining until impact. Horror gripped Nolan as he realized the gravity of their situation. "Brace! Brace!" he screamed. "Come on, damn it!" Grace's voice was a raw shout of defiance as she slammed her fist on the ejection controls. Her frustration and fear merged into a singular, desperate act. The ejection sequence, a mechanical beast lying dormant until now, roared to life. The cabin shuddered violently, a tremor that ran through every bolt and panel. Anika, her seatbelt half clasped, was caught unprepared. Nolan, in a frenzied bid to assist her, struggled out of his harness. The force of the ejection was merciless, hurling Anika forward like a ragdoll caught in the unforgiving grip of physics. Her body careened out of the cabin. Too late, Nolan realized his mistake. The powerful suction of the ejection pulled him out into the open sky. His world turned into a tempest of fear and confusion. Tumbling through the air, Nolan struggled to orient himself, the ground rushing towards him in a dizzying blur. the violent wind roaring in his ears. He was falling, tumbling through the air. Below him, the ground, a churning sea of turmoil, was rushing up to meet him. His suit flapped in the wind, the roar deafening in his ears. He twisted and turned, his body in a dizzying tumble. The distinction between sky and sea blurred into an indistinguishable whirl of darkness and motion. In the distance, a dark shape plummeted toward the ocean. The Ranger, now just a falling star doomed to a watery grave. Impact. The spacecraft struck the sea in a colossal explosion of water and debris, a momentary spectacle of terrible beauty. A plume of water and fire shot skyward. Nolan's descent continued unabated, the ocean's surface racing up to meet him. His mind was a whirlwind of fragmented thoughts. Faces of loved ones, unfulfilled dreams, a life left unfinished. The reality of his impending doom struck him with a merciless clarity. The water approached fast, too fast. Fear, raw and primal, surged through him. A scream tore from his lips, lost in the howling wind. Time seemed to slow, each millisecond stretching out as Nolan braced for the inevitable impact. His body tensed, a final act of defiance against the fate that awaited him. Then, the sea's embrace. A crushing, violent blow. Cold, dark, silence. Chapter 20. 34 hours after the crash of Ranger 4. Nolan led the way, Grace and Doyle following as they emerged from the jungle. The dense foliage and vines gave way to a more open landscape, improving their visibility as they trekked along. The past few hours had been an arduous journey through the humid habitat jungle. They had crossed muddy ravines on fallen trees, ducked under thickets of twisting vines, and climbed over crumbling stone barriers covered in moss. With fewer obstructions, Nolan surveyed their surroundings, getting his bearings. He estimated they had traveled miles from the jungle's edge. His eyes traced along the curved habitat interior, settling on the Great Sea, where the Ranger 4 lay crashed beneath the waves. Though not visible, Nolan could mark the location of their disastrous splashdown. "Try raising Eva again," Nolan said to Grace, nodding towards the radio. Over the last few hours, they experienced nothing but silence when trying to contact Eva. Grace, with a hint of frustration, pressed the transmit button once more. Static hissed through the speaker, a harsh contrast to the surrounding stillness. They waited, hoping for a crackle of life, a voice in the white noise. But there was nothing. Nolan pointed, his finger tracing the gentle upward slope of the cylindrical landscape. "If you look up there, you can see where the camp is," he explained. The curve of the habitat's interior gave a disorienting impression, making the beach seem like it was positioned along the wall. This oddity, a product of artificial gravity and centripetal force, resulted from their unusual environment. As they continued their journey towards the decaying city, its silhouette dominated by crumbling skyscrapers and remnants of a once thriving civilization, Grace trailed behind, limping. Without noticing what she was doing, she rubbed at her infected leg as she scrutinized her handheld radio. As they approached the crumbling metropolis on the habitat horizon, Grace threw up a hand. "The signal's not coming from the city itself," she said, examining her tracker. Gesturing to the right, towards the city outskirts, she added, "It's coming from over there." The trio adjusted their course, making their way towards the edges of an ancient development. The landscape here bore the scars of time and neglect. Buildings lay in ruins, their structures succumbing to the relentless embrace of nature. Vines clung to the fractured facades, and the air was thick with the scent of decay. The first thing that caught their eye was a weathered statue, its form eroded but still hinting at the grandeur it once held. Beyond it, the detritus of a lost civilization lay scattered. A peculiar object half buried in the ground caught Grace's attention. She kneeled, her fingers working to free it from its earthen grasp. As she pulled it out and brushed off the dirt, its circular shape became clear. "Is it some kind of wheel?" she wondered aloud. Nolan leaned in for a closer look. "I don't think so," he mused, his eyes tracing the contours of the object. These look like some kind of helicopter blades, or rotors. Amid the ruins, the debris told a story of decay and abandonment. Buildings once proud now stood as barely recognizable skeletons, their facades eroded by time and neglect. Remnants of a civilization that had once thrived here littered the landscape, now reduced to a ghostly echo of its former glory. "Look," Doyle said, 30 paces away. An escape pod protruded at an angle from the rubble-laden ground. They raced over to it, slowing as Nolan held up a hand. "Something's off. This pod's been here a very long time," he observed, noting the heavy corrosion and debris accumulated around it. Rectangular in size between a car and coffin, he saw it was designed for minimum space, just large enough to sustain life. Hardy vines curled around it, hinting at ages of uninterrupted growth. "This kind of wear and tear takes a long time to build up," Nolan said. Doyle kneeled beside the pod, his palm scraping off layers of mud. Beneath the grime, words emerged. Frontier 1. "If this is where the signal is coming from," Doyle said, "then where's our rescue team?" Nolan shook his head, a sinking feeling in his stomach. "I don't think there is any rescue team." "Something doesn't add up here," Grace said. Nolan, his mind racing, gestured towards the pod. "Let's get it open." Doyle worked, prying at the hatch, clearing the filth caked along its handle and hinges. Nolan joined in, pulling at the door with a determined effort. As they struggled with the pod, a crackling sound broke the silence. The radio, attached to Grace's belt, sprang to life. "Is anyone out there?" The voice was frantic, laced with panic. "Can you hear me?" "It's Eva." Doyle looked concerned. Grace grabbed the radio. "Eva, we hear you. We've been trying to reach you. Are you okay?" "No." Eva's voice came through, strained and breathless. "It's not me. I'm okay. It's Anika. She's gone." The 3 crew members exchanged a look, a shared sense of sorrow and confusion descending upon them. "What do you mean, Ava?" Grace said. "Slow down. Tell us what happened. How did she die?" "No, not dead. She's gone. Something took her." Eva's voice trembled. The words hung heavy in the air, incomprehensible yet ominous. "Ava, we don't understand," Grace said, her voice a mix of concern and bewilderment. "I don't understand either," Eva said. "I had walked down to the shore. I was still right there, just a few paces away. But I turned my back, and there was this noise. When I turned around, she was gone. Something dragged her away into the jungle." A loud groan rose from the pod, interrupting Eva's chilling account. Doyle let out a triumphant yell as the hatch broke free of debris and swung open with a resounding metallic clatter. "Eureka," Doyle said. Grace keyed her radio. "Eva, get to safety. We're on our way back for you now." She moved to leave, but Doyle held up a staying hand. "Whoa, easy there, sweet cheeks. We just got this baby open," he said, gesturing at the gaping pod. Grace wheeled on him, incredulous. "Eva needs our help." Doyle shrugged. "Eva can wait a few more minutes. We hiked all this way. We're not leaving without figuring out what this signal is." Grace's expression twisted into one of clear disgust. "Make it quick, then." Nolan peered into the opened hatch. It revealed a cramped interior, filled with analog switches, gauges, and screens. His eyes settled on a computer control console with a faded screen mounted on the equipment. Doyle rummaged around, extracting an aged backpack. He dumped out an assortment of mundane items: medkit, flashlight, tools, a crumpled map, some personal effects, then pulled out a computer disk. "Pay dirt," Doyle muttered in satisfaction. But Nolan's attention was drawn elsewhere. As Doyle moved to insert the disk into the pod's computer drive, Nolan's eyes caught on something half hidden under a tattered blanket. He reached for it, his hands trembling as he unearthed a long metal object, worn with age. He turned it over in his hands, a feeling of recognition growing within him. "It's my harmonica," Nolan whispered, disbelief etching his voice. "What?" Grace turned. Before anyone could probe further, the computer screen flickered to life, the disc beginning its playback. A figure stepped into the frame, and Nolan reeled in shock. On the screen was himself, standing in a dim room, his expression grave, eyes reflecting a mix of determination and unease. In the background, just visible, was the large cylindrical shape of the nuclear reactor core of Frontier 1. "What in the world is this, Nolan?" Doyle asked, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. "I swear I don't know anything about this video," Nolan insisted, dumbfounded. "I've never seen this before in my life." The on-screen Nolan began speaking, his tone bleak. "Day 518, he said. "I've decided I'm going after Magnus. It's just me now. Everyone else is gone. No one's coming back. If I stay, I'll be trapped here forever." He took a moment, his gaze shifting as if recalling a complex puzzle. The code worked. Against all odds, it worked. The artifact, it was the key all along. I don't fully understand how, but it's connected to everything, to this habitat, to us. His eyes lit up with feverish intensity. "I've secured the core. It's the only power source that's even close to strong enough for what I need to do. I just have to pray it works. The theories are sound, but the practical application, that's a whole other story. If my calculations are off, even by a fraction." He trailed off, leaving the sentence hanging. He leaned closer to the camera, a sense of urgency in his voice. "I need to get to the facility. It's the only place where I can do what needs to be done. But it's not going to be easy. I know she's watching. Samsara. She's been one step ahead since the beginning. If she realizes what I'm planning, she'll reset everything. Again. This might be my only chance to break free from this cycle." The on-screen Nolan's expression hardened. "I have to avoid another reset at all costs. This is about more than just survival. It's about the truth behind Black Horizon, about what's really happening here." The video's last frame trembled, then dissolved into a chaotic dance of static. The abrupt end of the video left a chilling silence in its wake, full of unanswered questions. Grace and Doyle both turned their attention to Nolan, their faces etched with confusion and suspicion. "I have no clue what that video is, guys," Nolan insisted. Grace, seeming to notice the radio still clutched in her hand, snapped back to the present reality. "No one's coming to rescue us. We need to get back to the beach," she said. As she limped towards the beach, Doyle hesitated, peering into the depths of the escape pod. Nolan, caught in a moment of indecision, looked from Grace to Doyle, and then down at the harmonica in his hand. The cold metal against his skin sent an unsettling shiver through him. Nolan's voice, a mere whisper, seemed to hang in the air, a silent echo. "What the heck is this place?